Chapter 13:17. On November 5th, the Persian Empire finally responded to Great Xia's ultimatum. The king of Persia claimed that if Great Xia was willing to pay a ransom, the Persian Empire would be happy to send the Ogdi tribe back to Great Xia to maintain their friendship. The specific ransom can be discussed, said the king of Persia. The king of Persia was an extremely intelligent man. He was not really greedy for the ransom, but he wanted to use it to shut the mouths of those who opposed him within the empire. In this way, the Persian Empire would not only send out a hot potato, but also maintain the internal stability of the empire. It was the best of both worlds. In order to get Great Xia to agree, the king of Persia claimed that the ransom could be discussed. In fact, under such circumstances, even if Great Xia did not give a single cent, the king of Persia would be happy. Ouyang Shua considered the conditions proposed by the king of Persia and chose to accept. Firstly, the Ogdi tribe had always been a sore point for Wang Jian, the commander-in-chief of the West Asia Theater. The earlier it was settled, the better for Wang Jian to get into the groove. Secondly, Ouyang Shua did not really plan to declare war on the Persian Empire in the coming spring. The highlight of Great Xia next year should be the Indian district. Only after conquering India would the empire have the energy to continue westward. The strength of the West Asia Theater and the South Asia Theater was not enough to support a two-front war. At this time, agreeing to ransom the prisoners of war could confuse the Persian Empire. In short, both sides had their own plans, and it all depended on who would win in the end. November 20th, the border of the Xinjiang province, Nanxing Pass. Great Xia had two passes at the border of the Xinjiang province, one in the south and one in the north. The northern pass was called the Beita Pass, and the southern pass was called the Nanxing Pass. Together, they guarded the border. These two passes were also the only two passageways from Great Xia to the Persian Empire. Outside, the two passes were basically mountains and precipitous ridges that were difficult to cross, let alone march. This showed the strategic position of the two passes. Among the two passes, the Nanxing Pass was the most important as it led directly to the hinterland of the Persian Empire. A year ago, when Ogdi led his troops to retreat, they passed through this pass. Even earlier, when the Mongolian army marched west, they also passed through this pass. The automatically generated pass had modeled walls that had accumulated the traces of time and witnessed countless historical moments. The core army of the West Asian Theater of Operations, the 1st Legion of the Flying Bear Army, the true trump card of the West Asian Theater of Operations, was stationed at the South Gate, while the 2nd Legion of the Flying Bear Army was stationed at the North Tower Pass. The remaining 3 legions were also stationed outside the two passes. In the early morning, the cold wind was biting cold. The bone-chilling cold pervaded the air, and the breath exhaled immediately turned into white mist, rising into the air. At the top of the southern city wall, teams of soldiers stood tall and straight, braving the bitter cold. They were like statues, loyally guarding the borders of the empire. Their thick black iron armor was already covered with a layer of white frost. Only their resolute eyes showed that they were still alive. Right at this moment, a wave of heavy footsteps came from the top of the city wall. Walking at the front of the group was a middle-aged general in military attire. His expression was firm, and his face was sharp as a knife. His pair of triangular eyes were especially spirited. "General." Along the way, all the soldiers saluted. The newcomer was none other than the commander of the Southwest War Zone, the great general of the empire, Divine General Wang Jian. As early as yesterday afternoon, Wang Jian had arrived at the southern city pass under the protection of his personal guards. This time, he was appointed by the imperial court to receive the Ogdi tribe at the border of the Persian Empire. Last night, Wang Jian suffered a rare insomnia. After a year, the grudge between him and Ogdi had finally come to an end. Wang Jian was deeply moved by His Majesty's sympathy. Standing on the city wall, Wang Jian gazed at the undulating mountain range and the winding mountain path within the mountain range. His eyes were distant, and no one knew what he was thinking. When the surrounding soldiers saw this, they all held their breaths, not daring to disturb the general's contemplation. In the next hour, Wang Jian stood in the cold wind, not moving at all. Like the surrounding guards, he seemed to have turned into a statue, guarding the borders for the empire. Wang Jian had always been thinking about when he could command the army out of the southern city pass through the mountain range, and kill his way into the heart of the Persian Empire. On the battlefield, he would once again make great contributions. In history, Wang Jian had never done an expedition to the foreign lands. He really wanted to do it, to spread the name of Huaxia and Great Xia's might in the foreign lands. Around 9 in the morning, on the mountain path in front of the pass, the rumbling of horse hooves suddenly echoed in the valley. It was impossible not to hear it, even if one didn't want to. "General, they're here." The personal guard captain came forward to remind him. Wang Jian nodded. He saw the Persian Empire's army marching majestically on the official road, kicking up a cloud of dust. As the troops moved forward, Okodai's tribe, including Okodai himself, were all tied up with a long rope. They walked in the middle of the troops, all of them dejected and pale. When they fled to the Persian Empire, Okodai's tribe had a total of 200,000 people. In just a year, they had died in battle, starved to death, or some other reason, but Okodai's tribe was left with less than 150,000 people. It could be seen that they did not have a good time in the Persian Empire. Many of the soldiers had long regretted it. If they had known this would be the result, they would have surrendered to Great Xia. At least they could have reunited with their families. Not only were they drifting in the foreign lands, they were also being bullied and humiliated. To be honest, most of the soldiers were not sad about being sent back. It was too precious to be able to return to their homeland and see their loved ones again in their remaining years. Of course, Okodai was not among the happy ones. Okodai was very clear about the fate that awaited him after being sent back to Great Xia. The best outcome would be imprisonment until death. Speaking of which, Okodai was also resentful. He really could not understand how the Persian Empire could be so useless. Just based on Great Xia's ultimatum, they would gladly hand them over. There was no hesitation at all. If he had known earlier, he would not have surrendered to the Persian Empire. Okodai did not know that the reason the Persian king was willing to accept Okodai's tribe was not because he liked them, but because he wanted to smoothly reclaim the cities that the Mongolian Empire had captured. As for Okodai's tribe, the Persian people did not forget that it was them who had led the Western expedition and caused a massacre at the Persian border. How could the Persians forget such a deep blood feud? Precisely because of this, after Okodai's tribe surrendered, there was no need for the Persian king's instructions. Naturally, there were people who dealt with them, and they became more and more unscrupulous. First, the soldiers' pay was deducted, followed by their rations, and finally, they were separated and imprisoned. After that, when Okodai's tribe became a group of sick cats, they would directly rush into the military camp and brazenly take revenge. Their methods were ruthless. More than 70% of the 50,000 people who died in battle died this way. Chapter 13:18. There was no medicine for regret in this world. The Persian army escorting the Okodai tribe stopped 1,000 meters away from the southern city wall. Only one general continued to advance under the protection of a group of guards until he reached the vicinity of the city gate. "Let's go." Wang Jian turned around and descended the wall. In a flash, the city gate opened and Wang Jian and his group walked out. To ensure the safety of the handover, the Western Asia Theater had already made sufficient preparations. Other than the Southern Pass garrison, there were also cannons set up in the mountains outside the city. The purpose was to prevent the Persian Empire from cheating. Although the possibility was small, they had to be prepared. "Hello." The Persian general greeted first. Wang Jian looked up and saw that the other party was an old general. He was thin and tall, fully clad in armor. His golden beard was especially eye-catching. According to the intelligence, this person was called Xerxes, the commander of the Persian Empire's eastern border. "Hello." Wang Jian nodded without batting an eyelid. If there were no accidents, the next time they met, they would be mortal enemies on the battlefield. Xerxes seemed to understand this as well. The two generals were sizing each other up. There was a faint killing intent in the air. "Let's sign the agreement." Wang Jian said. The two generals were authorized by the imperial court and were responsible for signing the agreement. Xerxes asked, "What about the ransom?" In the agreement signed by both parties, there was no specific amount of ransom. This meant that Great Xia could pay as much as they wanted. Wang Jian smiled and took out a gold coin from his bosom. He pretended to be serious and said, "Here." Looking at the gold coin, Xerxes' face flashed with shame. Great Xia setting the ransom at one gold coin was undoubtedly a humiliation to the Persian Empire. Xerxes struggled for a while, but he finally tolerated it. He took the gold coin expressionlessly and handed over an agreement. After Wang Jian signed it, it officially came into effect. Wang Jian saw Xerxes' expression and his heart sank. The other party's experience and patience made Wang Jian even more wary of the neighboring country. What happened next was simple. Ogdi and the other generals were handed over and temporarily detained in the southern pass prison. As for the rest of the soldiers, they were sent into the pass one by one. For safety reasons, the entire process would last for 2 days. Every time South City Pass received a batch of prisoners of war, they would be transported to the rear to ensure the smooth flow of South City Pass. What outsiders didn't know was that on that very night, Ogdi died in prison, and the one overseeing his execution was Wang Jian. Of course, this was done on Ouyang Shua's instructions. Otherwise, no matter how daring Wang Jian was, he wouldn't dare to act recklessly. As for the rest of the soldiers, if they were injured or sick, the imperial court would arrange for military doctors to treat them. After some minor arrangements, some would be directly sent back to their hometowns, while others would be incorporated into the Xizang Construction Corps or the Xikang Construction Corps. Great Xia did not suffer a loss by redeeming 150,000 strong laborers with one gold coin. Through this, the imperial court would be able to win over the hearts of the Mongolians to a certain extent. It could be considered killing 2 birds with 1 stone. In the blink of an eye, winter arrived. The global battlefield was silent, entering a rare period of truce. Due to the interference of the Grand Xia, the Dawson dynasty's advance in the Mayan battlefield had been extremely slow. Before the truce, they hadn't made any progress at all, causing Jack to feel very depressed. The European battlefield still maintained a dangerous balance, especially after Great Xia's firearms began to be shipped into the Germanic Empire. The valiant Germanic nation resisted the pressure on the front line. This winter was very important to the Germanic Empire. In Africa, the Bantu dynasty's performance was very aggressive. With the Angola region as the battlefield, they started a life-and-death rally with the Dawson dynasty's army. Now, it all depended on how determined the Bantu dynasty would be next year. Before the new year, the Bantu dynasty had placed an order for firearms worth 20 million gold coins with Great Xia. This showed that the Bantu dynasty's ambition wasn't small. Although Ouyang Shua was cautious, he still accepted the order. What surprised Ouyang Shua the most was the Tianzhu battlefield. He didn't know what King Ashoka was planning, but after redeeming the 1 million prisoners of war, he didn't enter the battlefield. It was as if the 1 million soldiers had never appeared in the first place. Next year's Tianzhu battlefield was definitely going to be a good show. December 25th, Christmas in the West arrived as scheduled. In the battlefields of America and Europe, many soldiers spent an unforgettable Christmas in the trenches. After Christmas, the 8th year of Gaia came to an end. December 30th, Gaia year, a system announcement resounded throughout the world. World announcement. On the 8th anniversary of the launch of Earth-On, the game will undergo the 9th and final system update, effective immediately. For the details, please log on to the official website. Once the announcement was made, the entire world fell silent. Unknowingly, the game world had passed its 8th year. Every year's system update was like a drama, affecting the entire world. There were a few updates that even brought about a disruptive effect. No one expected that this would be the final system update. This also meant that the 9th year of Gaia, the 10th year of Gaia, and even the foreseeable future would no longer have such regular changes. Gaia seemed to be consciously reducing its interference in the game world. Jingshi, Ouyang Shua cleared his mind of distracting thoughts and logged on to the official website, as usual, to check on the update. 1. Cancel the system announcement and system notification. From today onwards, regardless of the player's achievements, Gaia would not make a system announcement. The relevant achievements would only be announced on the official website in the form of a press release. This was also a crucial step in the game world's advancement towards realism. The system announcement seemed convenient, but it gave the players the feeling that Gaia was everywhere, forcefully announcing the information to everyone. This was not a good experience. The system notification was the same. It was Gaia exercising self-restraint. The player's privacy was fully protected. If necessary, the relevant system notification will be displayed on the player's communication compass in the form of an email or a message. It could be viewed at any time, making it very convenient. 2. Cancel a portion of teleportation arrays. From today onwards, every game zone, especially the most primitive game zone, can only maintain one teleportation array. Using the Great Xia as an example, if Ouyang Shua chose to leave the teleportation array spots for the capital, then the 9 royal cities, including Lingxi City, Sea Garrison City, Black Lion City, Heartstone City, Fallen Phoenix City, Luozi City, Lulan City, Hala Forest, and Huaining Prefecture, would all have their teleportation arrays removed. This would have a relatively huge impact on the Great Xia. The only thing that relieved Ouyang Shua was that most of the teleportation arrays in the overseas territories could be preserved. Otherwise, with the vast territory of the Great Xia, it would be a huge problem. Chapter 1319. The reduction in the number of teleportation formations had the greatest impact on the vast empires like the Great Xia, the Dawson Dynasty, and the Romanov Dynasty. In a short period of time, there would definitely be some inconveniences, especially for the Romanov Dynasty. Without the support of teleportation formations, their control over the Far East region would definitely be greatly weakened. This was the only good news for the Great Xia. Gaia's reduction in the number of teleportation formations was also a consideration for the industrialization process. With the rise of railroads, road transportation had entered a period of rapid development. As long as a complete network of railroads and roads was established, the use of teleportation formations would be greatly reduced. In the future, there was the possibility of Gaia eliminating all teleportation formations. Other than reducing the number of teleportation formations, Gaia also greatly increased the teleportation fees. For every person teleported, the teleportation fee was as high as 500 gold coins. It was truly an astronomical expense. This price was in line with the function of the teleportation formations. From then on, it would be impossible for an army to use teleportation formations. Just think about it. Just teleporting 100,000 soldiers would cost 5 million gold coins. And that was just a one-way trip. If the return trip was added, even the wealthy Great Xia would not be able to afford it. In the future, teleportation formations would become the choice of a minority of people in special situations. For example, if Ouyang Shua wanted to patrol the overseas territories, he could use teleportation formations. Of course, the number of people accompanying him had to be greatly reduced, or else the expenses would be astronomical. Stop the distribution of gold coins. In the entire world, aside from the Ashoka dynasty, there was no other NPC dynasty. Therefore, compared to before, the number of gold coins in the system's total production was becoming smaller and smaller. The main driving force behind the increase in the production of gold coins came from the gold mines around the world. For example, the 20 million gold coins that the Banto dynasty paid to the Great Xia for firearms came from the gold mines in the South Africa region. Otherwise, the Banto dynasty's finances would not be able to create such a value. In this update, Gaia completely stopped the production of gold coins. From now on, be it the system's capital cities, the rewards for players' quests, or the rewards for lords, there would not be a gold coin option. Not only that, Gaia also stopped the conversion of gold mines into gold coins. This also meant that on a global scale, the total amount of gold coins would no longer increase. Reforging gold coins into gold bricks like the Great Xia would also greatly reduce the number of gold coins. On the contrary, with the wave of industrialization, the global resources were increasing at an exponential rate. In the process of trade, there was an objective demand for the growth of gold coins. Otherwise, the value of gold coins would constantly increase. On a global scale, the value of gold coins would usher in a period of turbulence. In order to deal with this change, it was necessary for the various dynasties to issue their own currencies. In this way, gold coins, or rather, gold, would only be used as a measure of value in the future, but not as a currency for direct transactions. A new currency system was about to emerge. Of course, for a long time, the price of gold would still be an important reference for currencies. In the recently concluded 8th year of Gaia, Grand Xia had raked in more than 200 million gold coins from various overseas dynasties. Together with its own gold coins, it became the dynasty with the largest gold reserves in the world. According to preliminary estimates, more than 35% of the world's gold was stored in Great Xia. In this way, Great Xia would have the biggest say in the price of gold in the future. If they could obtain the right to set the price of gold, it would be even more incredible. Apart from that, Great Xia was also the first dynasty to establish a complete monetary system. The Great Xia currency had already been widely used in the empire and had entered the daily consumption of the commoners. Hence, the fluctuation of the gold price had the least impact on the Great Xia economy. Aside from the Great Xia, the Indian Empire, the Banto dynasty, and the Dawson dynasty would also become the winners of this great game of gold, thanks to their rich gold reserves. In comparison, the European dynasties were miserable. 4. Permanently banned nuclear technology. As the technology tree of the Second Industrial Revolution was fully unlocked, the birth of nuclear weapons such as hydrogen bombs and atomic bombs was probably only a matter of time. After all, there were no technological obstacles. Nuclear deterrence was clearly something Gaia did not wish to see. In the Federation era, all nuclear weapons had been destroyed, and what was left was the use of nuclear energy. Gaia clearly had its considerations when it listed nuclear technology as prohibited in the game world. Without nuclear deterrence, it would be difficult for the game world to have true peace. War would never disappear from the game world. 5. Open the Jindaya continent. The Jindaya civilization was the only one among the 4 known, mysterious civilizations that had yet to surface. According to legend, the Jindaya continent was a continent that rose from the bottom of the sea after an underwater volcano erupted 962,000 years ago. The sea that connected the African continent and the South American continent was where the continent used to be. The Jindaya continent set by Gaia was not only the last unopened map of the game world, it was also the main base of the monster's nest. On the continent, monsters ran amok, and it was a 100% simulation of the environment of Planet Hope. To the dynasties, this was clearly not a good place to go. Moreover, it was currently in a period of global chaos, so it was even more impossible for anyone to go there. On the other hand, Ouyang Shuo showed great interest in this. He was prepared to form an expedition team after the new year to explore the Jindaya continent. Obtaining information on the Jindaya continent was equivalent to obtaining information on Planet Hope. This was something that nothing else could compare to. The last system update only had the above 5 items. After Ouyang Shuo finished reading, he could clearly feel that Gaia was withdrawing from the game world as much as possible. The only thing that could face Gaia's existence was probably the player's real-time achievement points. In a year, the Xia territory expanded once again. More importantly, the quality of development had significantly improved. Even Ouyang Shuo's achievement points had experienced an explosive increase. As of now, Ouyang Shuo's achievement points had reached 50 million, more than tripled from last year. He was already halfway to the next level of S-rank authority. At this rate of development, Ouyang Shuo was likely to become the first human to have S-rank authority. What the players, including Ouyang Shuo, did not know was that other than releasing the system update, the NPC world was also quietly undergoing a round of update. After this round of update, the image of Mother Gaia would be erased from the minds of the NPCs. In their memories, the existence of Mother Gaia was only a distant myth. Gaia also gave the NPCs true freedom. From then on, The game world would really be like a real world. How vast was the universe? Not only the material plane was considered a real world. Virtual worlds like the game world that were built on data were also considered a real plane. There was no essential difference between it and the real universe. Chapter 1320. Just after New Year's Day, the imperial court of the Great Xia dynasty announced an inconspicuous appointment and dismissal of personnel. It was decreed that the secretary of the Pavilion of Secret Texts, Ouyang Bing, would be promoted to a scholar of the Pavilion of Secret Texts, responsible for the coordination and liaison between the cabinet and the four great academies. Binger's authority was flexible. This was equivalent to Ouyang Shu giving Binger a broader stage, allowing her to travel between the cabinet, the four great academies, and other institutions, familiarizing herself with the workings of the imperial court and preparing for the future succession. This process would take at least 2 years. Ouyang Shua had spared no effort in raising Bing and Bing had not let him down. The brother and sister had a tacit understanding. January 5th, the capital. Ouyang Shua presided over the annual military and political conference. Compared to the 24 ministers who participated last year, there were 2 newcomers this year. They were the Atlantic Fleet's Admiral Zhou Yu and the Western Borders Protector General Feng Xiuhuang. The newly promoted scholar of the Secret Text Pavilion, Ouyang Bing, sat in the corner of the meeting room as a recorder. Even so, the gazes of the 26 ministers still inadvertently swept to the corner, examining the elegant, quiet, and reserved young lady with pensive eyes. The officials had already guessed some of His Majesty's plans. Yesterday, the imperial court had announced the New Year's nobility promotion list. Dichen had been promoted to a 3rd-rank marquis, which had indeed caused a wave. However, the real focus was still on the eldest princess, Ouyang Bing. The eldest princess was conferred the title of King of Chu and became the first princess of the Great Xia dynasty. Before this, Great Xia had 6 kings. They were King Fu Su of Qin, King Lu Fuling of Han, King Yang Jin of Sui, King Li Ji of Tang, King Zhao Guangyi of Song, and Prince Xiaoming, Zhu Yunwen of Zhu Yunwen. Everyone knew that these 6 princes only looked impressive on the surface and did not have any real power. The eldest princess was different. As the emperor's one and only younger sister, not only had she been conferred the title of king, it was also one of the 4 most respected titles, Jin, Qin, Qi, and Chu. So the meaning behind it was naturally extraordinary. A few days ago, the eldest princess was promoted to a scholar of the Secret Text Pavilion, responsible for the coordination and communication between the cabinet and the 4 great schools. To be honest, this appointment made the ministers somewhat puzzled. After all, the scholars of the Pavilion of Secret Texts were only of the 4th rank. How could they take on such a heavy responsibility? As for the identity of the first princess of the empire, it didn't help the court at all. Instead, it would bring about a trace of negative influence. It was only yesterday that the ministers came to a sudden realization. If the eldest princess, as the king of Chu, was also a scholar of the Pavilion of Secret Texts, then all the problems would be easily solved. With regards to His Majesty's arrangement, there were ministers in the court who understood it in their hearts, but there were also those who were puzzled. For example, intelligent people like Jiang Shang and Zhang Liang could naturally understand a thing or two. They knew that His Majesty was making arrangements for Planet Hope. The ministers who did not understand would not refute him. In fact, there were already signs when His Majesty sent the eldest princess to Cheongzhou County to observe politics. 2 years of observing politics in Cheongzhou County and 1 year of learning in the Secret Text Pavilion had made the ministers gradually accept the fact that the first princess of the empire had entered the court. Because it was gradual, their rejection was naturally much less. Before the ceremony began, the Cabinet and the Grand Council made a brief summary report on the implementation of the strategy set during the ceremony last year. The situation of Gaia's 8th year was basically the same as Zhang Liang's judgment in the State of the Union address. The Silver Hand and the Azure Emblem were engaged in a life and death struggle, giving Great Xia the opportunity to roam around, fish in troubled waters, and expand their victory in South America and Africa. The crux was that Great Xia had only launched 2 wars in order to conquer 2 large overseas territories. Whether it was war consumption or military casualties, they were pitifully small. They relied on the powerful deterrence that Great Xia had established around the world, as well as their superb strategic layout. Such a feat made the other dynasties extremely envious. Taking the Dawson dynasty as an example, they had gone all out to conquer the sparsely populated Maple Leaf dynasty. For this, they had lost the Columbia region and a powerful ally, the Brasilia dynasty. Whether or not they had really profited was another matter. There is no need to mention the European dynasties. In order to take down the Germanic dynasty, they had almost fought to the death, but after fighting for a year, it was still a draw. Don't you think it's useless? This was reality. The strong became stronger, and the weak remained weak. Great Xia's current development was astonishing. It was like a giant rolling a snowball. With a casual roll, the territory that had expanded was something that the other dynasties could not compare with. What was even more terrifying was that this giant was still full of energy and was far from his limit. The Great Xia army had a total of 8 war zones. In the 8 years of Gaia, other than the American and African war zones, the remaining 6 war zones were basically recuperating. It was foreseeable that in the 9th year of Gaia, the 6 war zones would release an astonishing amount of energy. With the establishment of the American Protectorate and the rapid expansion of the African Protectorate, Great Xia's territory was perfected. If the base cities were included, Great Xia had territory in all 5 continents. It was a well-deserved title of a global empire. At the same time, the global chaotic war gave Great Xia an opportunity to take off in its industry. In terms of internal affairs, other than successfully dismantling the magistrate's office and completing the streamlining of the organization, Great Xia had achieved brilliant results in the fields of industry, education, transportation, sports, and the press. Initially, Great Xia's economy was at the top, but now it was flourishing everywhere. The highly efficient internal affairs system nurtured the military, allowing the Pacific Fleet to complete the upgrade ahead of time and be reborn. In one fell swoop, it became the world's first naval fleet composed of all sorts of ironclad warships. The world's #1 fleet was undoubtedly the Pacific Fleet. The once glorious Dark Knight fleet was once again trampled on and no longer dared to harass the southern border. After the upgrade of the Pacific Fleet, the next fleet to be upgraded was the Atlantic Fleet, which had just been reinstated. This was also one of the reasons why Zhou Yu attended the ceremony. Compared to the Pacific Fleet, the Atlantic Fleet actually shouldered a higher mission due to the development of the European and American dynasties. The challenges they faced were also the greatest. Therefore, it was very necessary to upgrade the Atlantic Fleet as soon as possible. At the same time, the imperial court had already initiated the establishment of the Mediterranean Fleet. It was temporarily divided into 2 fleets that would be responsible for patrolling the Mediterranean Sea in order to strengthen the empire's maritime control over the Mediterranean Sea. This way, it would relieve some of the pressure on the Atlantic Fleet. As for the specific establishment time, it was estimated that it could only be carried out after the Atlantic Fleet's upgrade was completed. Fortunately, with Great Xia's current industrialization standard and scale, it would only take half a year for the Atlantic Fleet to be reborn and become an existence that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the Pacific Fleet. When that time came, Great Xia's already wavering maritime supremacy would once again be established. Of course, with the advancement of global industrialization, the fleets of the European and American dynasties were also being upgraded. It was probably impossible for Great Xia to monopolize the global maritime control like before. Chapter 1321. Palace, First Conference Room. After summarizing the progress of last year's goals, Zhang Liang issued the New Year's State of the Union address as usual. With last year's experience, this year's State of the Union address was more detailed and targeted. Some strategic judgments made the ministers' eyes light up. In the 9th year of Gaia, the strategic focus of Great Xia would shift from overseas to Asia. The first to bear the brunt was naturally the three dynasties in the Indian region. Only by conquering India could Great Xia truly control the Indian Ocean and thus connect the maritime trade of the three oceans. In addition to India, the Persian Empire in the west and the Romanov dynasty in the north had to be dealt with according to the circumstances. The global situation was volatile. No matter how powerful the cabinet of ministers was, they could not accurately predict it. In addition to Asia, the Mayan and European battlefields were mainly indirectly intervening. They tried their best not to directly intervene. The goal was naturally to delay these two wars as much as possible. By doing so, it could let the enemies continue to consume each other, and it could also create a good external environment for Great Xia's military operations in Asia, reducing the possibility of interference. The competition between the Silver Hand and the Azure Badge is a rare strategic opportunity for the empire. Zhang Liang changed the topic and reminded, however, this period of strategic opportunity will not go on indefinitely. The cabinet of ministers has done a scientific assessment. If the two sides can't determine a winner in the 9th year of Gaia, then they will definitely stop and make peace. It is impossible for them to continue fighting to the death. So, there's not much time left for the empire. Zhang Liang emphasized again. Ouyang Shua agreed with Zhang Liang's judgment. In fact, the development of the war had put the Silver Hand in a dilemma. In their original plan, the Allies should have unified the European continent in the 8th year of Gaia. That way, they would have 2 years to integrate, digest, and even challenge Great Xia again. If Great Xia did not interfere, this strategic concept of the Silver Hand would indeed have a basis to realize. Not only in the European battlefield, but also in the American battlefield, the Dawson dynasty would have probably conquered the Mayan dynasty. If that was the case, the Silver Hand sphere of influence would have surrounded Great Xia in the east and west. The biggest mistake of the Silver Hand was probably underestimating Great Xia's influence and means. They also overestimated the pride of the Azure Badge and asked Great Xia for help. This winter was a rare period of strategic adjustment for the Silver Hand. After this round of adjustments, Ouyang Shua had reason to believe that the global battlefield would welcome new changes in spring. It was precisely because of this that the advisor cabinet suggested that the empire shift its strategic focus back to the Asian mainland. They should first expand the strategic depth of the mainland and obtain the position of the hegemon of Asia before taking care of other things. Basically, Gaia's 9 years of Grand Xia could only do so much. In addition to the military operations, the internal affairs naturally continued to strengthen the local infrastructure, especially the construction of the power grid, and comprehensively promote the industrialization of the coastal cities. Now that the capital was the first to be electrified, the construction of the empire's power grid and power plants would enter a period of rapid development, and the coastal cities would be the first to light up the night. With the blessing of electricity, the efficiency of industrialization would usher in another leap. With history as a mirror, the empire's path of industrialization was a highly condensed version of the global path of industrialization in history. Everything was extracted from the essence, and the planning was also the most scientific and fastest path. Throughout the entire process, there was not the slightest detour. In the first place, there was no room for detours, because the slightest pause could cause the other dynasties to surpass them. The game world was not reality. There were no technological bottlenecks between the dynasties, only resource bottlenecks and manpower bottlenecks. If one were to calculate further, it would probably be the difference in organizational and implementation capabilities. Regardless of which aspect, Grand Xia had a unique advantage. It was precisely because of this that there was no room for slacking off. Grand Xia had to work hard, bit by bit, to accumulate what might be a negligible advantage. After a long period of accumulation, they would finally establish an unshakable advantage. If they could really reach that step, Grand Xia would create another miracle. That was, Grand Xia would be able to rise above all the other dynasties in the world at the same starting line. This was an extremely impressive feat in addition to the mainland, the 3 overseas protectorates would also become the focus of construction. Ouyang Shua had already ordered the Transportation Bureau to cooperate with the 3 protectorates to draw up the infrastructure plan for the 3 overseas protectorates, build a railway network, and upgrade the highway network. For this, the imperial court had prepared a huge amount of funds to support the infrastructure construction of the 3 protectorates. This was also a blessing that the imperial court had brought to the local people. It would help strengthen the local people's recognition of the imperial court and promote the economic development of the 3 protectorates. In addition to the infrastructure construction, Ouyang Shua had also ordered the cabinet to conduct an in-depth research on the entire industry chain of the empire. He wanted to make the industries in the mainland and the 3 protectorates complement each other. He did not want all of them to work together, which would result in all of them being small and big, but not strong. To put it bluntly, he could not allow the 3 protectorates to continue producing for the mainland and become a raw material base. There was no consideration for the development of the protectorates, no regional discrimination, or even killing the goose that laid the golden eggs. This was what Ouyang Shua did not want to see. Hearing Ouyang Shua's statement, the 3 overseas protectorates, Mulanyu, Baihua, and Tao Wu, felt a huge weight lifted from their hearts, and they became even more motivated. In addition to the complementary industries within the empire, the 9 years of Gaia, the internal affairs of the empire, or rather, the trade strategy, had an extremely important point, which was to strengthen the trade with the Banto Empire and the Indian Empire. These 2 empires were large countries with gold reserves, but the development of their industries was extremely uneven. This gave Grand Xian an opportunity. In Ouyang Shua's words, he wanted to use a large amount of goods to empty the gold of the 2 empires, allowing the empire's gold reserves to rise to a new level. This series of trade measures was collectively referred to by Ouyang Shua as the War of Gold. In the future, to make the Great Xia dollar the global currency, the empire needed to have gold reserves that far exceeded the other empires, so as to strengthen its authority. Otherwise, no empire would easily submit to it. This was basically the Grand Xia's general strategy for the 9 years of Gaia. After the meeting, it would be broken down into specific goals and handed to specific organizations to organize and implement. Ouyang Shua had recently been talking about a word, activeness. He did not wish for the Great Xia to be an internally rigid empire, but a new generation empire that dared to think and act. The Great Xia at present was far from stagnating. The entire ceremony lasted for 2 days before it came to an end. Under the participation and witness of the 26 important officials, the empire's strategy for the coming year was finalized. After the meeting, Ouyang Shua held a banquet in the royal palace to celebrate the new year in advance. 4th February, the capital. Amidst the hustle and bustle, the spring festival approached once again. Chapter 1322. After the lively spring festival, the earth thawed and everything began to recover. For ordinary people, spring may only mean the beginning of a busy year, but for a dynasty, it could be a matter of life and death. In the past year, the Egyptian dynasty, the Brasilia dynasty, and the Maple Leaf dynasty were destroyed one after another. In the new year, who knew which dynasties would disappear? After the great waves washed away the sand, only the most tenacious experts were left. On the first day of the 3rd month of the 9th year of Gaia, not long after the spring festival, the Great Xia Royal Guards organized an expedition to the newly opened Jendaya continent for an exploration. The leader was the deputy commander of the Royal Guards' 1st Legion. Bright moon illuminates the river. In the 9th year of Gaia, Planet Hope was already in sight. Any ambitious dynasty would not let go of this opportunity to gather information. The Dawson dynasty, the Indian Empire, the Dark Knight Empire, and the European dynasties would all send expeditions to Jendaya continent to investigate. In the next year, Jendaya continent would be the stage for top adventurers to compete together. The 5th day of the 3rd month, the Indian district. Winter had just left. The first shot of the global war was not the European battlefield as expected, but the Indian district that had never had a sense of existence. King Ashoka, who had endured humiliation last year, finally bared his cold fangs. In the past winter, 1 million redeemed prisoners of war underwent 3 months of recovery training. In order to improve the physical strength of the soldiers, King Ashoka spared no expense and provided unlimited meat. Winter passed, and the million army returned to its peak state. With this as his backing, King Ashoka was naturally a little impatient. He took the opportunity, when the million army had not been discovered by the enemy, to take the initiative to launch a counterattack. It was just like the saying, kill 1,000 enemies, lose 800 of your own. In the war last year, the alliance of the Peacock dynasty and the Gudo dynasty had beaten the Ashoka dynasty badly, and their own consumption was astonishing, so it was not easy to win. Under such circumstances, the sudden addition of 1 million fresh troops was enough to change the situation. In the next month, under King Ashoka's personal command, the Ashoka dynasty's army split into two, from defense to offense, and sounded the horn to recover the lost land. Caught off guard, the allied forces were flustered and suffered heavy losses. The cities that the two dynasties had painstakingly conquered were lost at a speed visible to the naked eye. The Peacock king and the Gudo king were full of resentment. It was not until the middle of the 3rd month that they found out why the Ashoka dynasty was so fierce. Shameless. The Peacock king and the Mando king were angry and resentful of Great Xia's tricks, but there was nothing they could do. They couldn't do anything to Great Xia. In the face of power, they could only bite their teeth and swallow their blood. Although they were depressed, neither the Peacock king nor the Mando king would admit defeat easily. Seeing that it was already the 9th year of Gaia, they were too ashamed to allow the Ashoka dynasty to continue existing. This was the only NPC dynasty in the world. If they didn't get rid of the Ashoka dynasty, it would only make it seem like there was no one in India and they wouldn't be able to raise their heads in the world. This was something the proud Indians did not want to see. After withstanding the fierce attacks of the Ashoka dynasty and losing more than 10 cities, the two dynasties finally caught their breath and started to slowly stabilize their footing, waiting for an opportunity to launch a counterattack. Tacitly, the two dynasties sent more troops to the front line. As the saying goes, the first spurt of energy, the second will weaken, and the third will be exhausted. In the eyes of the Peacock king and King Gudwa, the Ashoka dynasty was fighting with their lives on the line. If they won, they could continue to maintain the tripartite balance of power. If they lost, the entire line would collapse. Hence, to the allied forces, this was a crisis, but also an opportunity. As long as they spared no expense and increased their investment to withstand this wave of fierce attacks from the Ashoka dynasty, they could launch a counterattack when the enemy was exhausted. They would definitely win the battle. The two dynasties were full of vigor. It was with this mentality that the war in the Indian zone entered the most intense stage. If nothing unexpected happened, the outcome of the battle would be decided in the first half of the year. After the start of spring, other than the Indian battlefield, the other battlefields also started to get lively. For example, the African continent. The system update that had just ended was a great blessing to the Bantu dynasty, which had an astonishing amount of gold. This previously inconspicuous local dynasty in Africa had entered the eyes of the entire world. Everyone was naturally eyeing the gold of the Bantu dynasty. The first to move upon hearing the news were not the dynasties, but the merchants from all over the world. They were like sharks that smelled blood, bringing along ship after ship of resources and sailing towards the Cape of Good Hope. In an instant, the port of Cape Town was filled with people. Massive amounts of resources surged into the Bantu dynasty from all over the world, bringing along box after box of gold. After Gaia's update, the dynasties from all over the world announced that they would start issuing dynasty currencies. During the transition period, gold coins were still the only currency. But after the currency was issued, gold coins would be prohibited from circulating in the market. The various dynasties would follow the example of the Great Xia, buying back all of their gold coins and forging them into gold bricks, which would serve as the strategic gold reserves of the dynasty. From then on, the massive amounts of gold coins would gather in a few banks. Every leader in a modern society understood the importance of gold reserves. As for the Banto dynasty, they were very happy to see the merchants from all over the world pay visits to them. Although the Banto dynasty was extremely wealthy, their own production efficiency was extremely low, and they relied heavily on imports. Naturally, the two of them hit it off. As the saying went, war is fought with money and a massive amount of resources. The influx of merchants had the effect of adding fuel to the flames of the Banto dynasty's northern expedition. The Banto dynasty, unwilling to be left out, placed all sorts of orders from the merchants as they prepared for war, once again starting a war against the Dawson dynasty in Central Africa. The flames of war in Africa were ignited once again. Faced with the aggressiveness of the Banto dynasty, Jack was very calm. He didn't add fuel to the fire and act rashly. Instead, he started a strategic defense. It wasn't that Jack was a coward, but that the Dawson dynasty's current focus was still on the Mayan battlefield. The Mayan War had developed to this point, and it wasn't something that the Dawson dynasty could stop if they wanted to. Once the Dawson dynasty's military strength at the front lines was slightly weakened, the Mayan dynasty would take a yard when given an inch. With the Great Xia supporting them, the Mayan dynasty clearly wasn't a pushover. They wanted to borrow the momentum of the Great Xia to give the Dawson dynasty a good fight. What the Mayan dynasty wanted wasn't just their defense. They knew very well that, geographically, the Mayan dynasty was sandwiched between the Great Xia and the Dawson dynasty. Their only way out was to focus on one direction and break out of the encirclement. The Mayan dynasty and the Great Xia each took what they needed. To put it bluntly, they were using each other. Under such circumstances, the Dawson dynasty naturally had to be careful and not allow the Mayan dynasty to cross their borders. Otherwise, where would their prestige be? Chapter 1323. The strangest part of the 9 years of Gaia War was the European battlefield. Until mid-April, the entire Europe was still peaceful, and there were no signs of another war breaking out. This was somewhat illogical. Ouyang even suspected that the European dynasties were going to stop the war. Of course, this was impossible. According to the intelligence from the Black Snake Guards, the European dynasties stopped the war for no other reason than to finish the spring plowing. After the consecutive wars last year, the dynasty's granaries were almost empty, so they naturally paid more attention to this year's spring plowing. The 6 dynasties formed a rare, tacit understanding. When Ouyang Shuo received the news, he shook his head in amusement. The Europeans were really gentlemanly. They seemed noble, but they were actually calculating to the bone. He wanted to see how the war in Europe would end up. 20th of April, Jingshi. The war in India had been going on for more than a month, but its momentum had not decreased. Both sides were fighting fiercely, and the front line had completely turned into a meat grinder. There were many casualties at every moment. The result of the internal friction was that the Indian district was declining. Whether it was the Peacock King or the Mando King, both of them were aware of this point. However, the war had already reached this point, and they had no choice but to win. Otherwise, they would not be able to explain to their subjects. Moreover, they were quite confident that with the overall strength of the Indian district, even if there was internal friction, they would not fear the provocation of outsiders, including the powerful Great Xia. Unfortunately, they were overconfident. The ferocious tiger, Great Xia, had been eyeing India covetously. In the first conference room of the palace, Ouyang Shuo personally presided over the joint conference to discuss the deployment of the war against India. The development of the situation in the Indian district was completely in line with Great Xia's expectations. Those who attended the joint conference included the Secretary of State and Chief Military Advisor of the Grand Council, Jia Su, Military Minister Du Ruhui, Commander of the Indian Ocean Fleet, Commander of the Imperial Guards, Hua Xiubing, Commander of the West Asian Theater, Commander of the South Asian Theater, Commander of the South Asian Theater, Commander of the South Asian Theater, and Commander of the Nanyang Theater, Commander of the 4 major theaters. The lineup was very grand. This conference could be seen as a war preparation conference, not an immediate war against India. With the rapid rise in teleportation costs, the method of directly teleporting the army to the front line was no longer advisable. To mobilize the troops of the four major theaters, they had to be deployed at least a month in advance. After the discussion of the Grand Council, they decided to divide the army to attack India into 3 routes. The Northern Army launched their attack from the border of Shikong Province, aiming straight for the Ashoka dynasty. The expeditionary forces included the 2 armies of the South Asian Theater of Operations and the 4 corps of the West Asian Army stationed in the West Sea Province. There were a total of 14 legions with a total of 700,000 soldiers. Li Jing, the commander-in-chief of the South Asian War Zone, was appointed as the commander-in-chief of the Northern Army. Zhuo Zongtong, the commander of the Soaring Eagle Army, was appointed as the left deputy general. Ho Junji, the commander of the Western Army, was appointed as the right deputy general. Ran Min, the commander of the South Asian Army, was appointed as the vanguard. In other words, the Northern Army would be further divided into 3 armies. The logistics of the Northern Army was under the sole responsibility of the South Asian Theater of Operations Logistics Support Center. If necessary, the West Asian Theater of Operations Logistics Support Center would provide logistical support. The Western Army launched an attack from the border of Hitao Province, the vanguard of the army heading straight for the Peacock Imperial Court. This army consisted of 3 legions of the Dragon Stallion Army and 4 legions of the Imperial Guard, for a total of 7 legions and 350,000 soldiers, exactly half of the Northern Army. The commander of the Nanyang War Zone, Wu Qi, became the commander of the Western Army. The commander of the Imperial Guard, Hua Xubing, became the left deputy general, and the commander of the Dragon Stallion Army, Zhang Han, became the right deputy general. The logistics of the Western Route Army was naturally the responsibility of the Nanyang Theater of Operations. The Southern Army launched an attack from the Nanyang Sea, the vanguard of the army heading straight for the Godo dynasty. The expeditionary forces consisted of 3 legions of the Southern Frontier Army and 3 formations of the Indian Ocean Fleet, with a total strength of around 210,000 soldiers, the least of the 3 armies. The commander of the Southern Frontier Army, Fan Li Hua, and the admiral of the Indian Ocean Fleet, Smoke and Fire, were each in charge of their own. The logistics of the Southern Route Army was similarly the responsibility of the Nanyang Theater of Operations. The total strength of the 3 armies exceeded 1,250,000 soldiers, including 24 field legions spread across the 4 major theaters of operations. This was the military operation involving the widest range and the largest number of legions after the reorganization of the Great Xia Army. It was clear that Ouyang Shuo was determined to win this battle. On the surface, it seemed that the Great Xia was launching an all-out attack, wanting to defeat the 3 Indian dynasties in one fell swoop. Of course, this was unrealistic. Even if the 3 Indian dynasties had serious internal strife, their total strength still exceeded 3 million, approaching the 4 million mark, and they could still conscript troops if necessary. Coupled with the vast territory of the Indian region and the large number of players, it was not so easy to bully. Otherwise, the Peacock King and the Mando King would not be so fearless. The Grand Council's arrangement was carefully thought out, and, at the same time, it was built on the basis of detailed intelligence. The main mastermind was poison warrior Jia Su. Through a few big moves, Jia Su had long established a great reputation in the entire army, and subsequently won the position of chief strategist. After representing the Grand Council and announcing the composition of the 3 armies, Jia Su gave a detailed explanation of the overall strategy. Jia Su first introduced the geographical environment of the Indian region. After several rounds of expansion, the Indian region monopolizes the entire South Asian subcontinent. To the north is the tall Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau, bordering the empire's Shikong province. To the northwest is the Hindu Kush Mountains and the Iranian Plateau, bordering the Persian Empire. To the east is the Indochina Peninsula, which is the Hatao province and Halua province of the empire's southern border. to the south is surrounded by the ocean. As a result, a relatively independent and relatively closed subcontinent has been formed, and its geographical location is relatively superior. Moreover, India is located between the Himalayas and the Indian Ocean, with abundant water resources, so this land has two major river basins, the Indus River and the Ganges River, supporting a large population. Specifically, the Ashoka dynasty monopolizes the Indus River basin and the Ganges River plain, occupying the most fertile land, so its strength is also the strongest among the three dynasties. The Peacock dynasty occupies the Ganges River delta area, which is also very fertile, so its strength is second only to the Ashoka dynasty and slightly higher than the Gupta dynasty. In contrast, although the Gupta dynasty monopolizes the southern area of India, its territory is mainly made up of hills and the Deccan Plateau, which extends south into the Indian Ocean. The geographical situation, to a certain extent, determines the fate of the three dynasties. Jia Su concluded. When the generals heard this, they fell into deep thought. The battle plan formulated by the Grand Council is based on the above geographical judgment. Jia Su then began to explain the battle plan. The Gupta dynasty in the south is the weakest, and its territory is mainly mountainous, easy to defend and difficult to attack, so it was designated as the last target. So, the Southern Army is just a feint, the smoke and fire demon asked. That's right, Jia Su nodded. The Southern Army's responsibility is to divert the energy of the Gupta dynasty so that they cannot reinforce the Peacock dynasty. Chapter 1324. Does the advisor mean that the Western Army is the real attacking force? Wu Qi asked. According to Wu Qi's judgment, the empire had just secretly supported the Ashoka dynasty. If the Gupta dynasty was feigning an attack, then the Peacock dynasty should be the real target. The problem was that the total strength of the Western Army was somewhat small. Jia Su still shook his head. Advisor, please enlighten me. Wu Qi asked. Jia Su said, the Western Army will fight first, then feign an attack, and then fight for real. This strategy was somewhat complicated, and the generals did not know how to respond. Jia Su explained, the intention is the same as the Southern Army, to restrain the Peacock dynasty so that they cannot focus on the front line and must retreat to create an opportunity for the Ashoka dynasty to counterattack. In the plan of the Grand Council, the time of departure of the three armies was different. The Western Army would be the first to launch an attack to attract the attention of the Peacock dynasty. Then, the Southern Army would cross the sea and land on the Gupta dynasty so that they could not reinforce the Peacock dynasty. This could be called the first stage. The strategic purpose of this stage was to cooperate with the Ashoka dynasty, give them space to play, and push the front line as far as possible. The more the Ashoka army gathers at the front line, the more advantageous it is for us. Jia Su said. Throughout the process, the Northern Army, as the absolute main force, did not move. Then, Jia Su explained the deployment of the second stage in detail, and the joint conference finally came to an end. The generals immediately returned to their districts and began to mobilize the troops. In particular, the Imperial Guards had to move from the capital to the Hatau province and must set off immediately. As for when to start the war, it needed to be flexible according to the situation in India. What needed to be done now was to assemble the various armies and transport the corresponding supplies. Time quickly entered May. The previously calm European battlefield finally ignited the flames of war again. Like in India, the European allies were not prepared to fight a protracted war. They reinforced the front line and must capture the Germanic dynasty in one fell swoop before the end of the 9th year of Gaia. Unexpectedly, in the European battlefield, the first to shine was the Spanish battlefield. On the 15th of May, the Egyptian army used 200 heavy artillery to bombard the Spanish capital of Madrid. After more than a month, they finally conquered the city. There was a breakthrough in the Spanish War. It was reported that the moment King Casillas learned of the fall of Madrid, his face turned pale and his body tottered. Casillas was too clear about the strategic position of Madrid city. With the fall of Madrid, The entire northern part of Spain was laid bare in front of the Egyptian army. If they were not careful, the Spanish dynasty might be destroyed. The only thing that allowed Casillas to maintain his composure was probably the 200,000 fresh troops that Fernando brought back from the front line, which gave Casillas confidence. Where did the Egyptian army get these heavy artillery? After the shock, Casillas began to come back to his senses and smelled something unusual. After fighting with the Egyptian army for so long, Casillas didn't know much about the enemy situation. The enemy didn't even have firearms, let alone heavy artillery. Could it be that it's sponsored by Great Xia? Casillas could only make such a guess, but he immediately rejected it. According to the information he had gathered, Great Xia did not have many heavy artillery in the African theater of operations. It was impossible to give all of them to the Egyptian army. It wasn't until a week later that the mystery was solved. It turned out that the Egyptian army's newly acquired heavy artillery came from the arms order that Azure Emblem had placed with Great Xia. On the surface, this batch of firearms was prepared for the Germanic dynasty. But in secret, Azure Emblem had distributed most of the heavy artillery to the Egyptian army. Azure Emblem's move completely disrupted the balance of power on the Spanish battlefield, creating a good opportunity for the Egyptian army to capture the city of Madrid in one fell swoop. It had to be said that Azure Emblem was really astute. They knew very well that if 100 heavy artillery arrived at the Germanic dynasty, it wouldn't have a decisive impact on the Germanic battlefield, but it would be able to influence the war in Spain. After reading the information, Casillas' face was filled with annoyance. If I had known this would happen, I wouldn't have given up the African territory so easily. It turned out that the firearms that Azure Emblem purchased from Great Xia were transported from the Mediterranean Sea. After Great Xia reorganized the Mediterranean Sea, this trade route became busy again. This gave the Germanic dynasty a chance. Now it seemed that the original decision of the Silver Hand was a big failure. It seemed that they had only given up a few territories, such as Morocco, but they had given up the opportunity to blockade the Mediterranean Sea. The unimpeded Mediterranean Sea was really endless trouble. Unfortunately, even if Casillas saw this, he was powerless to stop it. The Mediterranean Sea route, which had become busy again, had completely revitalized the caravans of the various dynasties along the way, bringing specific profits and convenience to local merchants, gentry, nobles, and even ordinary people. The Spanish dynasty alone could not blockade the Mediterranean Sea again. Moreover, at present, Great Xia occupied the main node of the route, and with the Atlantic fleet guarding it, it was not easy to blockade it. If the Spanish Invincible Fleet dared to make a move, it would immediately become the target of public criticism. What a ruthless scheme! Casillas was full of unwillingness, but he could only be depressed alone. In fact, Casillas' depression did not last long, because not long after the fall of the city of Madrid, a greater crisis was quietly shrouding the Spanish dynasty. Casillas was still ignorant of all this. May 22nd, Jingshur. Spring passed, and summer came. In the imperial garden of the imperial palace, hundreds of flowers competed for beauty, and it was beautiful. On the edge of Lake Tai, to the west of the imperial garden, the most powerful man in Great Xia was sitting on a small stool, holding a fishing rod in his hand, fishing leisurely. The palace maids, female officials, and palace guards around, including the divine martial guards in the distance, all held their breath and did not dare to make the slightest sound for fear of disturbing His Majesty's elegant mood. At this moment, rhythmic footsteps came on the gravel road. The person who came was the Minister of Military Affairs, Du Ruhue. At this moment, this giant with power was like a gentle and elegant scholar coming behind His Majesty. Ouyang Shuo seemed to feel something, and while staring at the fishing float on the lake, he whispered, "Are they almost there?" Replying to Your Majesty, "They will arrive tomorrow," Du Ruhue replied in a low voice. At this moment, the fishing float suddenly sank. Ouyang Shuo smiled, not afraid of disturbing the fish in the water, and said happily, "Good. The fish has taken the bait. The show is about to begin." As he said that, he swung the fishing rod, and a golden carp was hanging on the hook, still flopping. "Your Majesty is wise. Du Ruhue also smiled, congratulating His Majesty for his harvest. Chapter 1325. On the 23rd of May, in the Spanish Empire. Later that day, an elite force of 150,000 men, escorted by the Great Xia Atlantic Fleet, crossed the ocean and quietly landed on the southern coast of Spain. This place had long been within the sphere of influence of the Egyptian army. After the troops landed, they immediately joined the Egyptian army and rushed to the front lines. At the same time, the two field legions of the Great Xia Ravenous Wolf Army in the African theater crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and also landed in the southern part of the Spanish Empire. The three armies converged, forming a terrifying force. On the 27th of May, the three allied forces, in tandem with the Egyptian army, launched an attack on the northern part of the Spanish Empire at the same time. They were mighty and unstoppable. The sudden addition of an effective force was an existence that the Spanish Empire could not contend with. Coupled with the fact that the city of Madrid had been breached, the entire war situation in Spain was completely out of balance, and the scales of victory began to tilt in favor of the Egyptian allied forces. An unpredictable storm swept across the entire territory of Spain. In the next half-month, under the fierce attack of the allied forces, the Spanish army retreated step by step. One city after another fell, and the people within the territory were plunged into misery and suffering. Soon, the Allied forces reached the foot of the Spanish Empire's capital, the city of Tortosa. Once Tortosa was breached, it would mean the fall of the Spanish Empire. This battle completely shocked the world. No one would have thought that the Spanish battlefield, which had always been calm, would cause such a violent shock. The mysterious Allied forces suddenly appeared in front of the world. The appearance of the Ravenous Wolf Army in the African theater meant that the Great Xia had officially entered the European battlefield, and they were on the same side as the Azure Emblem, which made the Silver Hand feel like it was facing a great enemy. If the Great Xia and the Azure Emblem joined forces, the European battlefield would probably never have a peaceful day. In addition to the Ravenous Wolf Army, the identity of the mysterious landing force was finally revealed, which was shocking. It turned out that this elite force that had crossed the ocean was actually from the Bantu dynasty, the southernmost tip of the African continent. It was only at this moment that people realized that the previous attack by the Bantu dynasty on Central Africa was just a cover-up. The real purpose was to cover this elite force. It had to be said that the Azure Badge had made a good move. Without the Silver Hand noticing, it had used the Great Universal Shift. It had actually thought of transferring troops from the Bantu dynasty to reinforce the European battlefield. From this, one could see the Azure Emblem's determination to protect the Germanic dynasty. Of course, the success of Operation Azure Emblem was inseparable from the assistance of Great Xia. Without the protection of the Atlantic fleet of Great Xia, the Bantu Empire's army would not have been able to step onto Spanish soil. Furthermore, the greedy Wolf Army's sudden attack was naturally not without compensation. For this, the price that the Azure Emblem paid was to open up the financial markets of the Bantu Empire and the Maya Empire to Great Xia, officially recognizing the Great Xia currency as a foreign currency. In the future, the trade between the three dynasties could be settled in Great Xia dollars. To Great Xia, this was undoubtedly a historic moment. From this moment onwards, the Great Xia currency would officially become a global currency, and they would take a huge lead in the race to become a global currency. Even so, Ouyang Shuo still did not feel optimistic. The root cause was the Silver Hand. Based on the intelligence reports of the Black Snake Guards, the Dawson dynasty was about to establish a new currency system, named Dao Yuan. Soon, it would be implemented throughout the entire empire. Given the status of the Dawson dynasty in the Silver Hand, as well as the practical demands of the Silver Hand, it was only natural that Dao Qi would circulate freely within the Silver Hand. This was also beneficial to strengthening the internal unity of the Silver Hand and increasing the trade of the Silver Hand. In that case, it would be very easy for Dao Qi to surpass the Great Xia currency and become the world's #1 currency. It was precisely because of this that Ouyang Shuo had to put in so much effort to rope in the Azure Emblem in order to compete with the Silver Hand. In addition to assisting the Azure Emblem in attacking the Spanish dynasty, Great Xia also sent a delegation to the Indian Empire to discuss the circulation of the Great Xia currency in the Indian Empire. Roping in the Indian Empire was also an important part of Ouyang Shuo's plan. After the global chaos war, a currency war without gunpowder was quietly playing out on a global scale. In a sense, this was even more dangerous than the global chaos war. Great Xia could not afford to lose. The upheaval in the Spanish battlefield quickly spread to the European battlefield. Before this, in the eyes of the Allies, the Egyptian army was nothing more than a disease. With the Spanish dynasty blocking it, it would not cause any impact on the European battlefield. The only thing that made the Allies unhappy was the sudden retreat of the Spanish dynasty. Because of this resentment, after the city of Madrid was captured by the Egyptian army, some of the Allies were gloating. How could they have known that the situation would take such a sharp turn? For the Allies, the Spanish dynasty was a firewall that blocked the Azure Emblem. Now that the firewall was about to fail, the forces of the Azure Emblem were about to directly infiltrate the European battlefield. This made the Allies very anxious. The problem was that anxiousness could not solve any problems. The strength and tenacity of the Germanic people were beyond the imagination of the Allies. Under such a fierce attack, almost all of the people were soldiers, squeezing out the last trace of the dynasty's war potential. For people with no way out, this was a very terrifying force. The Germanic dynasty was difficult to deal with because of the ideological confrontation between the two camps, the Silver Hand and the Azure Emblem. Because of their different ideologies, it was difficult for the two sides to yield to each other. If the attacker was Great Xia, perhaps the Germanic dynasty's resistance would not be so strong. The world was so wonderful. After the turnaround on the Spanish battlefield, the Germanic dynasty became more and more tenacious, sometimes even taking the initiative to attack. The purpose was self-evident, which was to prevent the Allies from rescuing Spain. In fact, the Allies did not have such a plan. In the eyes of the Allies, instead of rescuing the Spanish dynasty, which was already 90% dead, it was better to fortify the Gaul dynasty and prevent the enemy from continuing north. Moreover, the Allies also had a dark mentality. They hoped that when the Spanish army finally could not hold on, they would take the initiative to abandon the city of Tortosa and enter the territory of the Gaul dynasty to take refuge. In that case, the remaining Spanish army would lose the dynasty to rely on and could only obediently join the Allies. This was the best result for the Allies. For this reason, both the European dynasties and the Silver Hand began to frequently contact Cassius, indirectly encouraging Cassius to abandon the city of Tortosa as soon as possible in order to preserve strength. After all, the Spanish dynasty still had more than 300,000 elite troops in the war so far. This was a force that could not be ignored. For this reason, the Silver Hand was either threatening or tempting, appearing very urgent. This time, Cassius neither directly refused, nor did he get angry. He seemed very calm. The facts were already in front of him. Without the Allies taking action, the Spanish dynasty would absolutely not be able to survive. Instead of struggling bitterly, it was better to leave a way out. Chapter 13:26. Cassius's hesitation gave the Egyptian coalition an opportunity. In the following week, the coalition launched a fierce attack on the city of Tortosa. The bombardment had the momentum of drowning the city, and the once prosperous city gradually became ruins. The coalition's determination was unshakable. In this situation, Spain's insistence had no meaning. On the 20th of June, with mixed emotions such as unwillingness, regret, and loss, Cassius led his troops to evacuate the city of Tortosa, then retreated all the way north, directly into the Gaul dynasty to seek refuge. The Spanish dynasty, which once had a glorious moment, became history. On the 21st of June in the 9th year of Gaia, a piece of news spread around the world. On the day after the Spanish dynasty was destroyed, Azerbaijan issued an announcement that the entire Spanish region would be included in the Germanic dynasty, becoming an overseas territory of the Germanic dynasty. The former king of the Egyptian dynasty would become the governor of Spain. According to Azerbaijan's original plan, they were prepared to restore the name of the Egyptian dynasty in the Spanish region. But because of Great Xia's intervention, they gave up. Because Ouyang Shua would never allow the Egyptian dynasty to reappear. If that were to happen, it would be a hidden danger that would explode at any time for Great Xia's African protectorate, causing the people's hearts that had finally calmed down to boil again. Right now, Azure Emblem and Grand Xia were in a new honeymoon period. Azure Emblem naturally couldn't turn a deaf ear to Grand Xia's reasonable protest, so they came up with a compromise. In fact, only the Egyptian dynasty's king would lose by doing this. For Azerbaijan, maintaining a unified dynasty in the European continent was obviously better than two dynasties existing side by side. Only then could they hit it off. On the 22nd of June, the ravenous wolf army began to withdraw from Spain. However, the 150,000 Bantu dynasty troops stayed. They would be integrated into the Germanic dynasty's military system along with the Egyptian army and be responsible for stationing in the Spanish region. Azerbaijan's strategic intentions became increasingly clear, which was to use all their resources to take root in the European continent. Of course, the existence of the Bantu dynasty still had an indispensable strategic significance to Azerbaijan. It was the last place of Azerbaijan's foundation. The Bantu dynasty's coveting of the Central African region would not stop there. Gaul dynasty, Vic City. The War of Spain that had just ended had a decisive impact on the European battlefield. After this battle, the Germanic dynasty finally saw the hope of turning the tables and decisively adjusted their battle strategy. Against the Romanov dynasty in the east and the Caesar dynasty in the southeast, the Germanic dynasty mainly focused on defense. If necessary, they could even sacrifice their limbs to survive and voluntarily give up some territory. Their main focus was on the southwest battlefront. This time, the Germanic dynasty would join forces with the Spanish region to form a pincer attack on the Gaul dynasty. This was the most critical step for the Germanic dynasty to break the deadlock. If the Germanic dynasty could take down the Gaul dynasty and connect the mainland with the Spanish region, not only would the Gaul dynasty be eliminated, but the Ganger dynasty would also be at a loss. The war in Europe would be completely reversed. At that time, the Germanic dynasty would truly be invincible. This was a very smart choice, but it was very unfriendly to the Gaul dynasty. It was no wonder that Harry was in an awkward situation and even felt a little angry. It was hard to judge whether the War of Spain had a positive or negative impact on the Gaul dynasty. On the one hand, the Gaul dynasty had gained a batch of 300,000 elite troops, and the dynasty's military strength had been significantly improved, especially when Cassius admitted defeat. To be honest, Harry was still a little happy. On the other hand, the Gaul dynasty had to face the threat of the Germanic dynasty. The raging war in Europe would soon burn from the Germanic dynasty to the territory of the Gaul dynasty. This was called blessing and misfortune dependent on each other. The most important thing was that with the surrender of 300,000 Spanish troops, the logistical weakness of the Gaul dynasty was once again magnified. If the war spread to the mainland, it would be one disaster after another. And this was where the confidence of the Germanic dynasty lay. It was no wonder that Harry was depressed. He was really more and more disappointed with the hand of silver. Romanov dynasty, St. Petersburg. Harry was depressed about the adjustment of the Germanic dynasty strategy, but someone was secretly happy. This person was the king of the Romanov dynasty, Pushkin. The Germanic dynasty's withdrawal of defense on the Eastern Front gave the Romanov dynasty a chance to advance westward, which was very much in line with Pushkin's strategy for the dynasty. Geographically, Russia was a country that was difficult to defend itself. The core area of most countries had a certain geographical barrier to establish a defense line. But the core area of Russia had existed since the Grand Duchy of Moscow in the Middle Ages. There were no mountains, rivers, or oceans around it to provide protection. Its defense was not based on terrain obstacles, but on the harsh climate to exhaust the enemy's strength. This defensive method, which caused great losses to itself, made Russia struggle with foreign invasions again and again, such as the Mongolian cavalry from the Eurasian steppe, the Teutonic Knights from the Bode Plain, Napoleon, the First German Empire, and the Nazi Empire. The expulsion of the Mongolian cavalry contributed to the formation of Russia, and the defense of Europe ended in Pyrrhic victories again and again. Therefore, in order to make up for its own weakness in defense, for Russia, expansion was the best defense. They had to expand all the way to the foot of the mountain and the coast. For the Romanov dynasty in the game world, it was always the dynasty's national policy to expand westward as much as possible. There was no end to such expansion, and controlling the Germanic dynasty was the best result. Because the Bode Plain was narrow in the west and wide in the east, the more one wanted to go west, the shorter the defense line. In order to open up the connection with the Spanish region, the Germanic dynasty shrank the eastern defense line, which gave the Romanov dynasty the opportunity to attack the Bode Plain. King Pushkin was a very courageous ruler. On the day he learned of the Germanic dynasty's strategic adjustment, Pushkin held an imperial conference and decided on a war that would topple the country, concentrating the dynasty's effective forces and attacking the Bode Plain. The Romanov dynasty, which had been half asleep before, was like a giant northern beast that suddenly woke up, turned over, and began to display all its abilities, laying the foundation for the dynasty. What was even more amazing was that this strategy of the Germanic dynasty was exactly the same as the strategy of the Allied forces. Therefore, to be able to obtain the support of their allies was simply too comfortable. In order to obtain the support of the organization, Pushkin could also be cunning for once. When he held an internal meeting in the Silver Hand, he first pretended to be unwilling and only pretended to accept after receiving enough promises. In fact, Pushkin had long been secretly delighted. June 25th, just as the Romanov dynasty increased the stakes on the European battlefield, there was a guy who seemed to be in a pain in the ass. Chapter 13:27. Some people were happy, while others were disappointed. The withdrawal of the Germanic Empire's defensive line was originally an excellent opportunity for the Kaiser Empire to expand. However, the Kaiser Empire had some misgivings and did not dare to swallow this fat piece of meat. What Caesar was worried about was naturally Great Xia, who was eyeing them covetously from the side. In this war in Europe, Great Xia didn't make a move, but once they made a move, they helped the azure emblem destroy the Spanish dynasty. How could Caesar, who lived next to Great Xia, not be terrified? Caesar was worried that while he was busy attacking the Germanic dynasty, the Great Xia army would come from the Mediterranean Sea and raid the backyard of the Caesar dynasty. If that really happened, Caesar wouldn't even have a place to cry. It was precisely because of this that more than half of the Caesar dynasty's troops stayed behind to guard the European Union during the most intense period of the war. They did not dare to go all out. The deterrence of Great Xia relieved a lot of pressure on the Germanic dynasty. Otherwise, the Azure Badge wouldn't have agreed so easily and given up the Egyptian dynasty on a silver platter. In fact, it wasn't just the Caesar dynasty. The Arab Empire was also wary of the existence of Great Xia. During the entire war in Europe, the Arab Empire didn't intervene at all. Those who did not know would think that the Arab Empire was a neutral dynasty, not the Silver Hands camp. In fact, both the Arab Empire and the Persian Empire were in an awkward situation within the Silver Hand, and they had no right to speak. That was why the two dynasties weren't so keen on the battlefield in Europe. Only the people involved knew how cold they were. June 27th, the capital. After the fall of the Spanish dynasty, Ouyang Shua's attention shifted away from the European continent. A month had passed, and the three armies that the Xia kingdom had planned to attack India were quietly in place. The relevant resources had also been allocated. All that was left was to wait for the order to begin the war of conquering India. During this period, there were new changes in the civil war in the Indian district. The Ashoka dynasty, with the power of millions of troops, faced with the reinforcements of the Peacock dynasty and the Guddo dynasty, still displayed a powerful destructive power, and the front line continued to advance. As of now, the Ashoka dynasty had recovered nearly two-thirds of their lost territory. The Peacock Imperial Court and the Gudo Imperial Court had worked hard for more than half a year, and when they were about to be returned, the Ashoka Imperial Court made a comeback. India's game of chess was truly a dazzling one. Under such circumstances, the Great Xia dynasty began a magnificent history of conquest. On the first day of the 7th month, the 3 legions of the Dragon Stallion Army of the Grand Xia's Nanyang War Zone brazenly crossed the border of Hitao Province and killed their way into the territory of the Peacock dynasty, opening the prelude to the Battle of Tianzhu. The 4 elite legions of the Imperial Guards followed closely behind. 2 elite troops, one in the north and one in the south, fought with the border army of the Peacock Imperial Court according to the established battle target, setting off the first wave of war at the border of the Peacock Imperial Court. When the news came out, India was in an uproar. If the previous battle in the Indian district was a tug-of-war between evenly matched opponents, then with the sudden intervention of the Great Xia army, the fragile balance was broken. Peacock Imperial Court, Bangalore City. Faced with the invasion of Great Xia, the Peacock King was both surprised and not surprised. In fact, in the 4th month of the 6th year of Gaia, after the Peacock Imperial Court lost the war against the Great Xia Kingdom, they had never let down their guard against the Great Xia for the past 3 years. At that time, the total military strength of the Peacock Imperial Court was around 900,000. After the defeat of the war, fearing that the Great Xia would counterattack, the Peacock King launched a round of crazy conscription, and the size of the Imperial Court's army rose sharply. At one point, the Peacock King was somewhat militaristic. There was no other way. The shock that the Great Xia brought to the Peacock King was too great. It was also because of the Peacock King's conscription at all costs that the Peacock Imperial Court's border was at peace for 3 years. Coupled with the annexation of a territory in the central region during this period, relying on a rich population reserve, when the Peacock Imperial Court joined forces with the Gudo Imperial Court to attack the Ashoka Imperial Court, the total military strength of the Peacock Imperial Court reached an astonishing 7 million. At the same time, the Gudo Imperial Court had a total military strength of only 4 million. In other words, when the civil war broke out in the Indian district, the entire Indian district had more than 6 million troops, close to 7 million troops. It was still the district with the strongest military strength apart from the Huaxia district. At that time, India was something that the Great Xia could not covet. The 1.5 years of civil war was really a veritable meat grinder, bringing a great disaster to the Indian district. In particular, there were several fierce confrontations where both sides suffered heavy losses. When the Great Xia suddenly declared war, the total military strength of the Peacock Imperial Court reached 850,000, less than the 900,000 before the reinforcement. Just from this simple set of numbers, it was possible to see the horror of a protracted war. Of the 850,000 troops of the Peacock Imperial Court, nearly 500,000 were deployed at the front line, supplemented by the new recruits this year, and only then were they able to block the attack of the Ashoka Imperial Court. The problem was that there was a certain gap in the border defense. Even so, the 350,000 elite troops were deployed at the border. In the Peacock King's view, he was very confident that he could block the Dragon Stallion army deployed by the Great Xia. Unfortunately, outsiders only knew that after the Great Xia's disarmament, the size of an army group was reduced from the previous 350,000 to 250,000, but they did not know the inside story. How could they know that the overall combat strength of the Great Xia army did not fall, but instead rose? Up to now, the penetration rate of firearms in the Great Xia army had exceeded 70%, the highest in the world. Strategic weapons such as heavy artillery, fighter planes, and combat puppets had been deployed to the division level. Just before the matchlock was withdrawn from the game stage, the elite troops of the Great Xia had begun to equip themselves with the latest generation of rifles to replace the flintlock. How could such a Great Xia army be compared to the past? Because of the asymmetry of intelligence and the addition of the Dragon Stallion army, the Peacock Imperial Court was naturally caught unprepared. In the first week of the war, they had lost 4 border cities. When the Peacock King received the news, he angrily slapped the table. In a one-on-one battle, even if the Peacock Imperial Court's army had the geographical advantage, they were still no match for the Great Xia army. Moreover, heavy artillery had already become the standard equipment of the Great Xia army. The previously solid cities were no longer an insurmountable moat, and with fighter planes, they could even more offset the geographical disparity between the attacking and defending sides. Moreover, the Great Xia had sent out 2 trump cards, the Imperial Guard and the Dragon Stallion Army. Even if the Peacock Imperial Court's army was more vigilant, they would not be able to resist the westward advance of the Great Xia army. For a moment, the Peacock Imperial Court's border was in a state of emergency. The war was like a dark cloud that shrouded the sky over the Peacock Imperial Court, suffocating everyone. On one side was the aggressive army of the Ashoka Imperial Court, eager to recover their lost territory. On the other side was their old enemy, the Great Xia army. The Peacock Imperial Court was suddenly caught in an unprecedented crisis. At this time, the Peacock King had to make a choice. Chapter 1328. In fact, the Peacock King did not have much choice. On the 10th of July, the Peacock King made a decision to transfer 150,000 troops from the front line back to the border. At the same time, he immediately sent envoys to Delhi to prepare for peace talks with King Ashoka. The Peacock King hoped to stop fighting with the Ashoka dynasty and unite against the foreign enemies. At present, our internal strife, no matter who wins or loses, is an internal affair of India. Now that the Great Xia has invaded, it is a foreign enemy who has come to steal India's territory. We must guard against it. If your country wishes to stop fighting and reconcile, I am willing to return all the cities and territories. I hope you will consider it carefully. Do not become a sinner of India because of a moment of happiness. The Peacock King said in the letter of credence. His words were sincere, showing both kindness and severity. In order to stop fighting, the Peacock King did not even hesitate to return all the occupied territories. Only when the two sides stopped fighting could the Peacock Imperial Court withdraw more troops from the front line to resist the invasion of the Great Xia. Otherwise, the Peacock Imperial Court would not be able to stop the army of the Great Xia. Between survival and expansion, the Peacock King naturally chose the former. The Peacock Imperial Court had great expectations for this peace talk. After all, in his view, if they could easily reclaim all the lost territories without losing a single soldier, it would definitely be a big temptation for King Ashoka. For this reason, the Peacock King even sent a letter to the King of Mando, persuading him to give up the occupied territories and fight against the invasion of the Great Xia together. The Great Xia is a fierce army with a big appetite. We should advance and retreat together. Although the two dynasties belong to different camps, they should have a consensus on the issue of the Great Xia. Sure enough, the King of Mando quickly replied, saying that he would send an envoy to Delhi to discuss the matter of peace talks. As a result, the weight of the peace talks immediately became heavier. The only thing that made the Peacock King suspicious was that the King of Mando only said that he wanted peace talks, but did not clearly state that he would return the occupied territories. The Peacock King could understand the King of Mando's thoughts. The main body of the Mando dynasty was in the Deccan Plateau, and the territory occupied by the Ashoka dynasty was the most fertile. It was of great significance to the Gudao dynasty and could not be easily given up. Moreover, the Great Xia did not attack the Mando dynasty at the moment, so the King of Mando was naturally not so anxious. The Peacock King could not persuade him and could only wait and see. He believed that after enduring for 3 years, Great Xia suddenly sent troops to India. It was not without purpose. The upcoming battle might exceed everyone's imagination. It was impossible for the Renduo dynasty to be completely independent. At that time, the king of Renduo would definitely come to his senses. In particular, when he thought about how the Great Xia dynasty had suddenly returned 1 million prisoners of war to the Ashoka dynasty, a trace of gloominess flashed across the Peacock King's eyes. He vaguely felt that Great Xia might have been plotting against India since a long time ago. It's windy. The Peacock King shuddered at the thought of the internal strife in India that lasted a year and a half. Ashoka Dynasty, Delhi. As the only royal city in India, Delhi city's grandeur was not inferior to any other royal city in the Huasha district. Due to the layout of 9 by 9 becoming 1, it even had its own unique charm. It was one of the most magnificent cities in the world. In July, the city of Delhi became lively because of the sudden invasion of the Peacock Imperial Court by the Great Xia. In just 2 days, 2 envoys came to Delhi with great fanfare. This was a trick used by the Peacock King. He wanted to use this method to spread the message of peace talks throughout Delhi city to win the support of public opinion and increase the bargaining chips for the peace talks. Normally, the Peacock King's response was appropriate and there was no problem. The only problem was that the Great Xia dynasty was 1 step ahead of the Peacock Imperial Court. Half a month before the Peacock Imperial Court sent out the envoys, the Great Xia envoys had already quietly arrived in Delhi city. Today, the Great Xia dynasty's use of diplomatic means was already as pure as fire, and no dynasty in the world could match it. The Great Xia envoys brought goodwill and threatened to cooperate with the Ashoka dynasty to destroy the Peacock Imperial Court and the Guddu Imperial Court in one fell swoop. This proposal was in line with Ashoka's intentions. With the current strength of the Ashoka dynasty, they could barely resist against the joint forces of the Peacock Imperial Court and the Guddu Imperial Court, but to really destroy the 2 dynasties, they were still not strong enough. If the Great Xia dynasty was willing to come forward, it would naturally be a battle. Therefore, the 2 sides signed the covenant happily. The Great Xia dynasty even sent Zhang Yi, the minister of the Grand Herald, to personally attend the signing ceremony of the covenant to show respect to the Ashoka dynasty. This, of course, made Ashoka very satisfied. The cooperation between the 2 sides even had a tendency to develop into a honeymoon period. Therefore, when the Peacock Imperial Court's envoys arrived in Delhi city, although they played tricks, they were unsurprisingly given the cold shoulder. Not to mention seeing Ashoka, they didn't even see the face of an important minister. This was embarrassing. The envoys came with great expectations, but could only return dejectedly to report. A farce, before it had even begun, ended without any results. Not only that, on the day that the Peacock Imperial Court's envoys arrived in Delhi city, the Ashoka Imperial Court's army intensified their attack on the front line, showing no mercy. The Peacock Imperial Court withdrew 150,000 troops from the front line, giving the Ashoka Imperial Court an opportunity. The Great Xia dynasty sent out a large number of troops to attack the Peacock Imperial Court, confirming the promise made half a month ago. How could Ashoka negotiate peace with the Peacock Imperial Court and only be satisfied with recovering the lost land? What Ashoka wanted was most of India. In order to confuse Ashoka, the Great Xia dynasty even stated in the covenant that when India is divided in the future, the Great Xia dynasty only wants the territory of the Guddu Imperial Court and give the Peacock Imperial Court to the Ashoka Imperial Court. Great Xia only occupied India for the sake of controlling the Indian Ocean, the emissary vowed solemnly. Although Ashoka was skeptical, he was still very excited when he heard the division plan. If he could occupy all of the Peacock Imperial Court for 2 days, not only could the Ashoka Imperial Court recover its strength, but it could also rise to a higher level. The Peacock King was extremely disappointed when he received the news. Facing the pincer attack of the Ashoka dynasty and the Great Xia dynasty, the Peacock dynasty could not withstand it all and could only hope for the assistance of their ally, the Guddu dynasty. Unfortunately, Great Xia had already predicted this. On the 15th day of the 7th month, the Great Xia Southern Army, under the escort of the Indian Ocean Fleet, landed on the eastern coast of the Guddu dynasty. The Guddu dynasty simply had no time to deal with anything else. Like the Peacock Imperial Court, the 1.5 years of war had caused the army of the Magwa Imperial Court to suffer heavy losses. Their forces were reduced to less than 700,000, and more than half of them were sent to the front line. From a king of Guddu's point of view, It was unlikely that Great Xia would covet the Gudo dynasty, which was located in the hilly region. Even if they were to fight, they should fight the Peacock imperial court first. It turned out that the judgment of the king of Manduo was correct. The Peacock imperial court was indeed the first to be attacked. The problem was that the appetite of the Great Xia dynasty was extremely big. They were aiming at the entire India district, and the Gudo dynasty naturally could not escape. The expedition of the Great Xia Southern Army completely destroyed the idea of the king of Manduo reinforcing the Peacock imperial court. For a time, the situation of the India district ushered in a new change. The previous 1v2 of the Ashoka imperial court gradually evolved into an epic 2v2 showdown. Chapter 1329. The Gudo dynasty could not even take care of themselves and ended the last chance of survival for the Peacock dynasty. With the cooperation of the Great Xia and the Ashoka dynasty, the eastern and western armies launched a pincer attack on the Peacock dynasty. For a time, the Peacock dynasty could not attend to one thing, and their territory fell at a speed visible to the naked eye. The Peacock king was anxious, but it was of no use. On the contrary, against the Gudo dynasty in the south, the Great Xia army and the Ashoka dynasty tacitly adopted a relatively conservative strategy of harassment and restraint. As long as the Gudo dynasty did not reinforce the Peacock dynasty, everything was fine. The Gudo king was not a fool. He knew that the enemy did this not to let the Gudo dynasty go, but to destroy them one by one. When the Peacock dynasty was destroyed, it would be the time for the Gudo dynasty to suffer. However, with the military strength of the Gudo dynasty, they had enough defense, but not enough counterattack. The situation was already very clear. In this 2v2 life and death battle, the powerful alliance of the Great Xia and the Ashoka dynasty had suppressed the Peacock dynasty and the Gudo dynasty. Victory was only a matter of time. July 20th, Tianju. Just as the allied forces of the Great Xia and the Ashoka dynasty were winning, a piece of discordant news spread within the Tianju district, causing a crack to appear in the close cooperation between the two sides. The matter had to be explained from a week ago. After the Great Xia Western Army invaded the Peacock dynasty, every time they occupied a city, they arranged for people to loot all the supplies in the city and transport them to the nearby Hitao province. Not only that, even the people in the north of the city were looted and forcibly moved to Hitao province. The strange actions of the Great Xia were suspicious, because this was not in line with the usual practice of the Great Xia army. According to the discipline of the Great Xia army, they had never offended the people and mainly appeased the local people and gentry. They had never heard of the Great Xia having such a practice of draining the pond to catch the fish. Outsiders did not know the inside story, but when Ashoka received the news, it was clear. According to the covenant signed between the Great Xia and the Ashoka dynasty, the territory of the Peacock dynasty would be ceded to the Ashoka dynasty in the future. The Great Xia naturally wanted to reap the benefits. It's just that the way they eat is a little too ugly. Ashoka was a little unhappy. A few days ago, because the cooperation between the two sides was still in the honeymoon period, Ashoka did not say anything and endured the war. Unexpectedly, because of Ashoka's tacit approval, the Great Xia army's looting operation became even more unbridled. According to the scouts at the front line, the Great Xia army was practically scraping the ground. After the war, when the Ashoka dynasty took over those cities, they would probably get empty cities. This would be a huge violation of the Ashoka dynasty's interests. When King Ashoka received the report, he couldn't help but report the situation to Emperor Xia himself. After receiving King Ashoka's message, Ouyang Shua attached great importance to it. He first expressed his apologies before saying, "The frontline soldiers acted recklessly and disobeyed orders. It was my fault. I will definitely give your country an explanation." This made Ashoka very confused. Could it be that the actions of the Great Xia army were not instructed by Emperor Xia? Ashoka would never believe it. Everyone knew that the Great Xia army was known for its strict discipline. If it wasn't for the imperial court's instructions, they wouldn't have dared to loot like this. Or could it be that a certain minister of the imperial court of the great Xia dynasty instructed him to do so? Ashoka judged others by himself and did not rule out this possibility. Of course, the greatest possibility was that the Xia emperor himself was pretending to be deaf and mute in order to avoid losing face. He, Ashoka, had played such tricks many times. Fortunately, with the Xia emperor's promise, regardless of the truth, this matter should be able to come to an end. Ashoka was also very tactful and did not mention the issue of compensation for the looted cities. As long as the great Xia army could stop the looting, this little loss was nothing. In fact, it was not worthwhile for Ashoka to fall out with great Xia just for this little benefit. In any case, although the situation of the war in India was advantageous to them, before complete victory was achieved, any variables could happen. At this time, the most taboo thing was to have internal conflicts and cracks in the alliance. Ashoka was very clear about the principle of righteousness. After the incident, Ashoka was very happy because he handled this matter reasonably and calmly without losing his rationality. Unfortunately, it turned out that it was too early for Ashoka to be happy. After Ashoka personally appealed, on the surface, the great Xia army did indeed stop the looting, which made Ashoka heave a sigh of relief. Just a week later, there was a new situation. According to the reports from the frontline spies, the looting of the great Xia army turned from overt to covert. Although they didn't openly plunder money and supplies, they invited merchants to Hatao province to invest and do business. Faced with the personal visit of the soldiers, how could those merchants not agree? At the same time, the Great Xia Southern Border Protectorate also brazenly recruited talents in the occupied areas under the guise of recruiting outstanding talents. Although they didn't sweep away all the commoners, they took away all kinds of talents, which were the essence of the population. Great Xia's method was very clever. Under the banner of voluntary looting, there was not a single flaw. Not to mention, due to the continuous years of war, the merchants and all kinds of talents in the occupied areas extended an olive branch to Great Xia, and not all of them were forced. A large portion of the commoners voluntarily settled down in the Southern Border Protectorate. After all, it was human nature to pursue an easy and comfortable life. In contrast, the commoners weren't very interested in the Ashoka dynasty. When Ashoka received the report, he was so angry that his face turned black, but he couldn't flare up. Because of the active cooperation of the commoners in the occupied areas, Ashoka really didn't have the face to complain to Emperor Xia. As an emperor, Ashoka also had self-respect. He couldn't be like a peddler and argue with Emperor Xia until his face was red and ears were red. In the end, he was like a little wife who had been wronged, crying and saying, "You can't do this." Ashoka couldn't afford to lose face like this. No, we must take measures. Ashoka was a proud person. After suffering a loss, he wanted to get back at them. Not being able to complain didn't mean that Ashoka had no way. "Come," Ashoka shouted. "Here," Ashoka ordered. "Pass the order to my personal army. I want to personally lead the troops to the front line to supervise the battle." Yes, Ashoka's plan was very clear. Since he couldn't stop the little tricks of Great Xia, then he could only rely on strength to speak. He concentrated the troops on the Peacock Imperial Court's battlefront and started a race with the Great Xia army. The earlier the Peacock Imperial Court was captured, the less losses for the Ashoka dynasty. The more cities they captured, the less cities Great Xia would have to capture. This method seemed very clumsy, but it was the only countermeasure that Ashoka could think of. I want to see how many cities the Great Xia army can capture. Chapter 1330. On the 29th of July, the capital, hearing that King Ashoka had personally gone to war and stepped up the offensive against the Peacock Imperial Court, Ouyang Shah, who had been sitting in the capital and overseeing the overall situation, was accompanying his 4-year-old daughter to paint in the Imperial Garden. Ouyang Shah smiled lightly when he heard this. "At least you have some composure, but you still took the bait in the end." "Your Majesty is wise." Duruhui, who had rushed over to report, also smiled. As one of the planners of the attack on India, Duruhui certainly knew the reason. The imperial court had instructed the Western army to plunder, to infuriate the Ashoka dynasty, and continue to deplete their strength in preparation for the next step of the plan. The anxious Ashoka might not have noticed that while the Ashoka dynasty's army was intensifying their attack, the Great Xia army had quietly slowed down their pace of attack. The Ashoka dynasty bore more than 70% of the pressure. In the blink of an eye, it was August. More than half of the lively Gaia 9 years had passed, and the interstellar fleet was getting closer and closer to Planet Hope. At this sensitive juncture, all the players had new expectations for their future. Of course, there was also the fear of the unfamiliar environment. The various dynasties have been exploring Gendia for more than half a year, and the feedback was enough to make people fearful. The cruel environment of Planet Hope was far beyond people's imagination. Even the most elite expedition team found it difficult to advance on the Gendia continent. Then, as a group, how would ordinary players establish themselves on Planet Hope? Fear was human nature. As social creatures, fear often made it easy for people to stick together. In such a situation, with the Federation's era already gone, the existence of the dynasty was a source of warmth and was the most important support for the players. According to the information revealed by Gaia, the future base on Planet Hope would be built by dynasties, and a powerful dynasty would naturally give people more confidence. With this opportunity, the happiness of the Great Xia players soared. In the entire world, there was no dynasty stronger than Great Xia, and no dynasty more peaceful than Great Xia. Apart from the Chinese players, even the other overseas players living in Great Xia had a soaring sense of identity with Great Xia. The will of the empire gradually gathered together, accumulating strength for the development of Planet Hope. Ouyang Shuo was the master of this strength. Some people's happiness soared, and naturally, there were others who were unfortunate and worried. For example, the European continent that was burning with the flames of war, India that was beset by internal and external problems, and the Mayan dynasty that was the sandwich. The European continent, in particular, has always been known as the birthplace of democracy. For a year and a half, the flames of war had not stopped. Whether it was the Allies or the Germanic dynasty, there was more or less anti-war sentiment. As time passed, this emotion grew stronger and stronger. The players weren't fools. They knew that behind this battle was the struggle between the Silver Hand and Azure Emblem camps. No matter who won or lost, the ones to bear the consequences were still the ordinary European players. For a time, the European player community's condemnation of the Silver Hand and the Azure Emblem came in waves. Ouyang Shuo's eyes flashed when he received the letter. The critical point he had been waiting for was about to arrive. He immediately instructed the Black Snake Guard's European division to add fuel to the fire. Only by disbanding the two major organizations would Great Xia be able to sit back and relax. In order to disband the two organizations, in addition to destroying the dynasties of the two camps, they also had to form a public opinion to denounce the two organizations, making them morally untenable. The spontaneous condemnation of the players was the best catalyst. Ouyang Shuo was just adding fuel to the fire. Even Ouyang Shuo couldn't predict what kind of power this sound would eventually evolve into. He could only wait and see. At least at this stage, it was still impossible to influence the actions of the dynasties. Under such circumstances, the European battlefield was still in full swing. The Germanic dynasty launched a desperate attack on the Gaul dynasty, while the Romanov dynasty picked up the leftovers to the end. The Caesar dynasty was reduced to nothing. The most awkward one was the Gangder dynasty. On one hand, the Gangder dynasty had to deal with the harassment of the Germanic dynasty in their own territory. So far, they hadn't eliminated the 100,000 invading Germanic dynasty army. On the other hand, with the great change in the European war, the Gangder dynasty's arrangement in the Gaul dynasty was also very awkward. They couldn't advance or retreat. There were signs of division within the allies. especially after seeing that the conquest of the Germanic dynasty was still far away. The dynasties involved naturally lost their previous determination and began to make their own small calculations. Ouyang Shuo predicted that the stalemate in the European battlefield would soon be broken. Apart from the European continent, there was still no sign of the chaos surrounding the Maya dynasty in the American continent being resolved. Both sides were advancing and retreating, fighting near the border. Most of the energy of the Dawson dynasty was involved in this. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the American war zone of the Great Xia cooperated with the Atlantic Fleet to attack the Greater Antilles archipelago. Soon, they would be able to occupy the entire Greater Antilles archipelago. By then, the Great Xia would have a say in the Gulf of Mexico. As for the Caribbean Sea, it would completely become the territory of the Great Xia. In the past few years, apart from attacking on land, the Great Xia had never stopped conquering the islands in the sea. For example, the famous Galapagos archipelago around the original county had been brought under the rule of the Great Xia. Darwin's theory of evolution originated from there. Then, the Madagascar archipelago in East Africa had also been brought under the rule of the Great Xia, laying a solid foundation for the Great Xia to control the sea route from the Cape of Good Hope to the Indian Ocean. As for the islands in the Indian Ocean, there was no need to mention them. Recently, the Great Xia was still conquering the small islands on the periphery of the Strait of Gibraltar. Only by controlling these small islands would they be able to communicate with the Strait of Gibraltar and completely control the sea route from the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. According to incomplete statistics, up to now, there were no less than 10,000 islands of various sizes under the rule of the Great Xia. There were no less than 1,000 islands that could be inhabited. Unknowingly, the Great Xia had also become a country of islands. Some of the islands might seem inconspicuous now, but because they were located in key locations on key sea routes or could serve as transfer stations, the role they could play in the future was sometimes no less than that of a province. In history, England had once given up an inconspicuous island to Germany. In the end, they suffered greatly in the future World War II and paid a price that was 100 or even 1,000 times more. Before the Federation era, although Morocco was also on one side of the Strait of Gibraltar, because they had lost control of the relevant islands, they had no sense of existence in the Strait of Gibraltar. Examples like this were too numerous to mention. Not to mention the role that an island could play in the future when they were in the maritime territory painting world. All in all, with the passing of the 9th year of Gaia, a new storm was sweeping the world, and in this storm, the war in the Indian district was about to usher in a decisive moment. Chapter 1331. August 15th, Tianzhu District. As the army of the Ashoka dynasty attacked the capital of the Peacock dynasty, Bangalore, the once illustrious Peacock dynasty became history. The Peacock dynasty became the second dynasty to disappear in the 9 years of Gaia. In order to take down the entire territory of the Peacock dynasty as soon as possible and not give the Great Xia a chance to take drastic measures, the army of the Ashoka dynasty fought fiercely under the supervision of King Ashoka. Although they won, they also suffered heavy losses. According to preliminary statistics, the Ashoka dynasty lost more than 200,000 soldiers in this battle. In addition to the previous war of revenge, the Ashoka dynasty had used up more than 80% of the millions of prisoners of war that were redeemed. Even so, King Ashoka was still very satisfied and even a little happy. This was because at the last moment, the remaining 300,000 soldiers of the Peacock dynasty surrendered to the Ashoka dynasty under the instruction of the Peacock King. As for the Great Xia side, they basically did not receive any prisoners of war. This showed the resentment of the Peacock King towards the Great Xia. Even at the last moment, he still wanted to trick the Great Xia. He would rather benefit his own people than let the outsiders benefit from the Great Xia. In this way, the total number of the army of the Ashoka dynasty did not decrease, but increased. After Bangalore city was breached, the Peacock King did not plan to stay in India, a place of sorrow. The winner was king, and the loser was the thief. There was no longer a place for him in India. On that day, Drava took a group of trusted aides and teleported to the Dark Knight Empire. Perhaps the paradise-like motherland would be the starting point of Drava's revenge against the Great Siah. The day after Bangalore was captured by the Ashoka dynasty, the Great Siah Western Army followed the relevant agreement of the alliance and stopped advancing westward, giving the opportunity to wipe out the remaining forces of the Peacock dynasty to the Ashoka dynasty. The commander of the Western Army, Wu Qi, sent a letter to King Ashoka, stating that after a short rest and replenishment of provisions, the Western Army would move to the Gudar dynasty's battlefront to continue the unfinished war. Not only that, even the persuasion and immigration that the Great Siah had previously carried out ceased with the end of the war and did not embarrass the Ashoka dynasty. King Ashoka was in a good mood, and at the same time, he had a higher opinion of the Great Siah. Although the Great Siah's previous actions were somewhat disgraceful, when it came to the implementation of the core terms, Great Siah was still very decisive and showed the demeanor of a great country. Previously, Ashoka was really worried that the Great Siah army wouldn't leave. In view of Great Siah's cooperation, Ashoka naturally had to return the favor. Other than leaving a portion of the army to guard the prisoners of war and wipe out the remaining pirates, the rest of the army would be transferred to the battlefield of the Gudar dynasty. After all, cooperating with Great Siah to take down the Gudar dynasty was an important condition of the alliance between the two parties. In the next half a month, the military forces of the Indian district began to gather towards the Gudar dynasty, making the situation of the Gudar dynasty, which was already hard to support alone, more and more difficult. The destruction of the Gudar dynasty was only a matter of time. Furthermore, since the Gaia decade was about to arrive, the Indian players were eager to stabilize the situation in India before that, and not fight back and forth like now. The players' enthusiasm for participating in the war quickly faded. Just like the destruction of the Peacock Imperial Court, more than 90% of the Indian players living in the Peacock Imperial Court chose to stay and did not teleport to other dynasties. To them, living in India was more meaningful. Moreover, the outside world had already spread rumors that the Peacock dynasty would be included under the rule of the Ashoka dynasty. Since that was the case, there was no need for the Indian players to change their allegiance with great fanfare. This was also a good thing for Ashoka. After all, to restore the strength of the Ashoka dynasty, especially to promote the industrialization of the Ashoka dynasty, this group of Indian players would be an indispensable backbone. With the limitations of history, Ashoka would not be able to handle this matter. Strictly speaking, although the Indians had a mysterious self-confidence and had been at odds with Huaxia since ancient times, the nature of the Indians was still very docile, and it was relatively easy to tame. Otherwise, the historical British Empire would not have been able to kill India for 300 years. The mysterious self-confidence of the Indians could also become docile in the face of power. As long as the ruler governed properly, India would be the next paradise. After all, even if one looked at the whole world, India had a unique geographical environment. 1 ST of September, the Mayan dynasty. Just as the Indian district was about to usher in a major reshuffle, there were new changes in the Mayan battlefield. After more than half a year of tug-of-war, Jack was a little irritated, even manic. The Mayan War, which could not be ended, had seriously tied the hands and feet of the Dawson dynasty, involving too much of the Dawson dynasty's energy. As a result, the Dawson dynasty could not do anything in the 9 years of Gaia. Even the Greater Antilles, which Jack regarded as an outer barrier, was taken by Great Siah during the chaos, directly threatening the safety of the Gulf of Mexico, which made Jack very depressed. In addition, with the changes in the European battlefield, the Azure emblem, with the help of Great Siah, fought a beautiful turnaround. The Allied forces were losing again and again, but at this time, the Dawson dynasty could do nothing. Jack was also very anxious. Because of this, Grandpa Jack was criticized at the regular meeting of the Silver Hand. The status of the Dawson family in the Silver Hand was declining because of the lack of response at this time, and there was even the danger of being pushed down from the altar. At this time, Number 1 had secretly urged Jack several times, no matter what strategy is adopted, in the Mayan War as soon as possible. This was something that Number 1 had repeatedly emphasized. Jack was also in a difficult position. If possible, he was very willing to stop the war. Compared to the small Mayan dynasty, Africa and the European continent should be the stage for the Dawson dynasty to gallop. The problem was that at this time, the Dawson dynasty could not stop the war even if they wanted to. This seemingly inconspicuous local battle was actually a three-way battle between the Great Xia, the Silver Hand, and the Azure Emblem. On the surface, it seemed calm, but in reality, undercurrents were surging. No matter which side suddenly withdrew, it would cause unpredictable chain reactions. Jack didn't dare to gamble. Once they lost control of the Gulf of Mexico, the lifeline of the Dawson dynasty's foreign trade would basically fall into the hands of the enemy. That would be a disaster for the upcoming global trade drama. Therefore, this time, the Dawson dynasty had no reason to withdraw. They couldn't withdraw, and they couldn't win. The Mayan War had almost become a dead knot, and this was what Great Xia hoped for. Ouyang Shual wanted to use this as a medium to completely trap the Dawson dynasty, so that Great Xia could speed up the construction of a global order. A truly global empire was gradually taking shape. Of course, Jack was unwilling to admit defeat so easily. He was also an extremely intelligent person. Faced with a dead knot, Jack could still have a flash of inspiration and come up with a solution that no one could guess. Even Ouyang Shual sighed in admiration. Chapter 1332. Faced with this dilemma, Jack thought of a good idea. As soon as September arrived, the Dawson dynasty sent a secret delegation to the Grand Xia. Their goal was to discuss with the Grand Xia how to divide the Mayan dynasty. That's right, divide the Mayan dynasty. According to Jack's logic, since the three parties couldn't come to an agreement, then the Grand Xia and the Dawson dynasty would first divide the Mayan dynasty, then talk about the conflict between the two dynasties. This was the style of the Silver Hand. September 2nd, the capital. After sending off the Dawson dynasty's delegation, Ouyang Shual summoned Jiang Shang, Zhang Liang, and Du Ruhui. How do you think we should respond to the Dawson dynasty's proposal? Ouyang Shual asked. The Dawson dynasty's proposal was not in line with the Grand Xia strategy in the Americas. In fact, it was the opposite. Logically speaking, Ouyang Shual should have rejected Jack's proposal, but he didn't. Instead, he summoned all the important officials to discuss this matter. The fact that he had summoned the three important officials to discuss this matter showed Ouyang Shual's attitude towards this matter. Thus, the three officials didn't immediately reply to His Majesty's question. Instead, they thought about it carefully. They couldn't go against His Majesty's will, nor could they try to smooth things over. To put it bluntly, they had to provide advice for His Majesty's decision. Otherwise, it would show that they, as officials, were too weak. After a while, Zhang Liang spoke. Your Majesty, I believe that the Dawson dynasty's proposal is not in conflict with the Empire's strategy in the Americas. I'm all ears. Ouyang Shual smiled. The Empire's strategy in the Americas can be summed up in 2 points. First, it is to restrain the Dawson dynasty and stop their global expansion. Second, it is to manage the Americas well and increase the Empire's power. That's right. Ouyang Shual nodded. Zhang Liang continued. If we divide the Mayan dynasty, given the power of the American theater of operations, we can totally replace the Mayan dynasty and continue to play the role of restraining the Dawson dynasty. As a representative of the military, Du Ruhui didn't dare to say everything. She suddenly interrupted. The American theater of operations has to take care of the entire American protectorate. It might not be as you wish. The American theater of operations had 3 armies. The South American Army had to guard the Amazon province, Brasilia province, and Uruguay province. The Brave Tiger Army had to guard the Colombian province and guard the Panama Canal for the Empire. Unless it was an emergency, it would be inadvisable to mobilize them. Even if they could, it would only be 1 or 2 legions. The only force that could truly fight against the Dawson dynasty at the border was the North American Army. How could a single army possibly contend against the Dawson Empire? Not to mention containment. Just maintaining peace at the border required 120% of their strength. According to Du Ruhui, she still hoped that the empire would maintain the status quo. Upon hearing that, Zhang Liang explained with a smile, "It's naturally impossible if we only rely on our strength on the surface. But don't forget that the entire empire is standing behind the American theater of operations. Just this alone is enough to make the Dawson dynasty feel fear." Hearing this, Du Ruhui and Jiang Shang looked at each other and smiled, not coming forward to refute. Indeed, to this day, no matter which dynasty it was, as long as they were neighbors with the great Xia, they would be fearful. Zhang Liang continued, "Let's talk about the second point. If they could divide up the southern part of the Mayan dynasty and directly rule it, it would be beneficial to develop the resources of the Caribbean Sea. It was also a rare opportunity for the American protectorate to develop. The empire could also use this opportunity to strengthen its involvement in the Gulf of Mexico, killing many birds with one stone. Your humble servant speculates that the Dawson dynasty made such a decision because they had no other choice." "Why do you say so?" Jiang Shang asked. "Because for the Dawson dynasty, occupying the entire Mayan dynasty is in line with their fundamental interests, thereby obtaining a bargaining chip to contend against the empire. Seeing that the war was not going well, continuing to delay was not a solution, which was why they came up with this plan. For the Dawson dynasty, allowing the empire to intervene in the Central American War would be akin to inviting a wolf into the house," Zhang Liang said. Ouyang Shuan nodded in agreement. At this point, Ouyang Shua looked at the three ministers and revealed the mystery. "The reason why we are interested in the Dawson dynasty's proposal is because of two reasons. First, with the fall of the Spanish dynasty, the situation of the Germanic dynasty in Europe has been greatly improved. This also means that the honeymoon period between the Azure Emblem and the Empire is most likely coming to an end." Jiang Shang and the other two agreed. Right now, the Great Xia was still allied with the Ashoka dynasty to attack the Azure Emblem's Gudo dynasty. There are no eternal friends, nor are there eternal enemies. There are only eternal interests. In this sort of situation, it is extremely necessary to deal with the ticking time bomb that is the Mayan dynasty. Ouyang Shua continued, "Secondly, after half a year of tug-of-war, the Mayan dynasty's national strength has already been greatly depleted. If the empire continues to indirectly influence the front lines, as long as the Dawson dynasty is willing to pay the price, they will still be able to win. When that time comes, the empire might end up like the Maple Leaf dynasty, with nothing to show for it. Although they will be able to suppress the Dawson dynasty to a certain extent, they won't be able to gain any tangible benefits. Previously, the Great Xia had sent a group of mercenaries to the Maple Leaf battlefield, but in the end, they were unable to prevent the destruction of the Maple Leaf dynasty. Naturally, the military base they had agreed upon had been scrapped. On the contrary, although the Dawson dynasty had paid an enormous price after conquering the Maple Leaf dynasty, as long as they managed it well, they would be able to recoup their losses in a few years. In the game world, at least at the current stage, the value and potential of land was enormous. It could even be the most valuable. For example, if the Great Xia didn't directly intervene and continued to help in secret, once the Dawson dynasty conquered the Mayan dynasty, the threat to the Great Xia's American protectorate would rise to a whole new level. Ouyang Shua said, "In view of this, I believe that now we should secretly divide the Mayan dynasty with the Dawson dynasty, kick away the Azure Emblem chess piece, and let the Empire personally take the field. This is the most suitable time." After hearing the analysis of the ministers, I am even more certain of my previous opinion, Ouyang Shua added. Indeed, Zhang Liang's analysis made Ouyang Shua completely dispel the last bit of hesitation in his heart. The sage strategist was indeed a sage strategist. When looking at a problem, he was always able to see the blood of the needle and point out the crux of the problem. "Your Majesty is wise." The three ministers bowed in unison. They had finally solved the mystery in their hearts. Ouyang Shua nodded, then looked at Jiang Shang and instructed, "Since everyone's opinion is the same, then the following negotiations will be led by the cabinet. Your humble servant will not shirk from this." Jiangshang readily accepted this task. Although it was said to divide the land, there was still a lot of detailed work to be done on how to divide it and how to plan it. Chapter 1333. The seventh day of the ninth month, the capital. The secret diplomatic mission of the Dawson dynasty, carrying the formal agreement between the two sides, began their journey back to their homeland. After 5 days of discussion, the delegations from both sides discussed the demarcation line of the Maya dynasty and the specific deployment of the war. They then reported it to the emperors of both sides and finalized it one by one. The next step was to execute the plan. September 10th. The Dawson dynasty used the autumn harvest as an excuse to temporarily halt their attacks against the Maya dynasty. Their armies began to retreat from the front lines in an orderly fashion, as though they were resting and reorganizing. 2 days later, the great Xia mercenaries stationed in the Mayan dynasty retreated from the front line and returned to the military base. The temperature on a Mayan battlefield suddenly dropped. The Maya dynasty had yet to realize the existence of the problem. Seeing that the temperature of the battlefield had dropped, they were happy to take a break. To tell the truth, the amount of pressure the Dawson dynasty had exerted on them during this period of time was quite enormous. The top bowstring loosened a little. Something unexpected happened on September 18th. Just as the front lines had relaxed, the Dawson dynasty's army, which had just retreated, suddenly made a comeback, and their momentum was even greater than before. The Dawson dynasty once more sent reinforcements to the front lines. When the Maya dynasty received the news, they were shocked. They anxiously ordered the front line to be on guard and contacted the Xia dynasty's mercenaries to ask them to end their rest and go to the front line to participate in the battle. Unexpectedly, the great Xia dynasty's mercenaries rejected the Mayan dynasty's request for battle, citing the fact that their troops had suffered heavy casualties and were in urgent need of rest and reorganization. According to the employment agreement signed by both parties, the Mayan dynasty did not have the power to force the mercenaries. Both parties only had an employment relationship based on money. Therefore, if the mercenaries were not willing to go to war, the Mayan dynasty could do nothing about it. After being rejected, the Mayan dynasty became anxious. Within a day, they sent 3 batches of people to the military base. The conditions they proposed were better and better. Unfortunately, the mercenaries remained unmoved. This delay lasted for another 5 days. During this period of time, because the great Xia mercenaries weren't around, the Mayan army's defensive pressure increased. They suffered heavy losses and lost 3 cities in a row. The Mayan king was as anxious as an ant on a hot pan. He did not hesitate to personally rush to the military base and request for the great Xia mercenaries to set off immediately and head to the front line to provide support. It was a pity that the Mayan king's reputation was not as high as it seemed. This time, the military base where the mercenaries were located was closed. The Mayan king was given the cold shoulder. Only then did the Mayan king realize that something was amiss. He also smelled danger in the air. But the situation at the front lines was critical, and the Mayan king didn't have much time to think. Without the help of the Grand Xia's mercenaries, the Mayan dynasty's army was beaten into a sorry state by the Dawson dynasty's army. The Mayan king had no choice but to seek help from the organization. The Azure Badge received the request for help from the Mayan king and took it very seriously. On the same day, they sent a delegation to the capital to personally mediate the matter. The Mayan dynasty was not only one of the 4 remaining dynasties of the Azure Emblem faction, but it was also the only existence of the Azure Emblem in the American continent. Its strategic position was very important. The problem was that the Great Xia army was currently working together with the Ashoka dynasty to pursue and attack the Goodode dynasty, which was also in the Azure Emblem camp. The honeymoon period between the two sides had ended before it even started. It was still a problem if he could convince Great Xia. What happened next confirmed the worries of Azure Badge's higher-ups. The Chamberlain of Great Xia's Chamberlain of Dependencies courteously received the diplomatic group and did not neglect them. The problem was that when it came to specific matters, the officials of the Chamberlain of Dependencies were secretive and did not want to discuss in detail. It was as if they were intentionally stalling for time. The game of diplomacy between the two sides was unlikely to have a result in a short period of time. The problem was that the front line did not wait for anyone. The following plot was very melodramatic, but it was also very fatal. It was enough to push the Mayan dynasty into the abyss. On the 1st of October, the Great Xia mercenaries unilaterally notified the Mayan dynasty to end the employment agreement between the two sides. Under the escort of the Atlantic Fleet, they set off for the Colombian province to be stationed. Although the Mayan king was furious, he could do nothing about it. It could even be said that the Mayan king did not dare to send troops to intercept them. Firstly, the military strength was tight, and secondly, he did not want any unforeseen events to happen at this critical moment. After all, the relationship between the two sides was purely an employer-employee relationship. As for whether they were allies or not, it might really be wishful thinking on the part of the Mayan dynasty. The relationship between the Great Xia and the Mayan dynasty had always been one of employment. The king of the Mayan dynasty was well aware of this. The worst was yet to come. On the 3rd of October, the day after the successful withdrawal of the Great Xia mercenaries, Great Xia brazenly declared war on the Mayan dynasty. The North American general Shui led 4 legions of the North American army to attack the Mayan dynasty from the Panama region. At the same time, the 3rd formation of the Atlantic Fleet was guarding the coast. The sudden declaration of war by Great Xia was undoubtedly a death sentence for the Mayan dynasty. It was only then that the Mayan king realized that, without him knowing, the two giants of the American continent had already reached a tacit agreement and secretly divided the Mayan dynasty. To be honest, this feeling was really depressing. I'm the meat on the chopping block. In such a chaotic world, the weak really could not control their own fate. The brazen Northern American army of Great Xia was like a cold military knife that stabbed the Mayan dynasty in the back, causing the unprepared Mayan dynasty to lose the last chance to resist. With the tacit cooperation between Great Xia and the Dawson army, the Mayan dynasty did not last for too long. On the 12th of October, the army of the Dawson dynasty was the first to conquer Mexico City, announcing that the Mayan dynasty, which once had a place in the world, was officially coming to an end. According to the agreement signed between Great Xia and the Dawson dynasty, both sides would use the foot of the Sierra Madre del Sur in Mexico City as the boundary, and the entire Mayan dynasty would be divided into 2. The Dawson dynasty occupied most of the areas in Mexico City. Relying on the mountains and deserts in Mexico City, it formed a natural barrier against Great Xia. In this way, the Dawson dynasty had a strategic buffer zone in the south. Great Xia occupied a little bit in the south of Mexico City and the entire Central American continent, specifically including Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. These areas would form the 5th province of the American Protectorate, the Caribbean province, together with the Panama region and the Greater and Lesser Antilles that were previously included in the Columbia province. The Caribbean province was worthy of its name. The entire Caribbean Sea was the internal sea of the province. With this expansion, the American Protectorate was successfully promoted to a superior protectorate and became the 3rd superior protectorate of Great Xia. At the same time, the former governor of Colombia, Zhou Haichun, was transferred to the governor of the Caribbean province and continued to guard the Panama Canal for the imperial court. With this transfer, Zhou Haichun also shouldered the heavy responsibility of guarding the border. The cooperation between Great Xia and the Dawson dynasty came to an end the moment the Mayan dynasty was divided. Next, the two dynasties would return to the state of confrontation. The Caribbean province was the front line. It could be foreseen that in the future, the two dynasties would surround the Gulf of Mexico, and there was bound to be a battle between them. Gong, the former governor of Ningdu in the Jiangchuan province, replaced Zhou Haichun and was promoted to the position of governor of Colombia. At this point, the layout of Great Xia in the entire American continent came to an end, and the new structure of the American continent was basically established. While Great Xia was busy dividing up the Mayan dynasty, the situation in the Indian region also changed. Chapter 1334. Due to the relative independence of the 8 major battlefields, the War of the Mayan dynasty had little impact on the Indian region. They continued to move forward step by step. In fact, their progress was even faster than the Mayan battlefield. On the 5th of October, before the dust settled on the Mayan battlefield, after a month of fighting, the allied forces of the Xia dynasty and the Ashoka dynasty finally sent the Gudo dynasty to their grave. The Gudo dynasty also became the 4th dynasty to be destroyed in the 9th year of Gaia. It could be seen that as the 10th year of Gaia approached, the War of Dynasties around the world was entering the most intense stage of fighting, and the destruction of dynasties ushered in a new peak. The survivors were kings. With the destruction of the Gudo dynasty, only the Ashoka dynasty was left in the Indian region. It had to be said that this was a miracle that belonged to the Ashoka dynasty. As such, the Ashoka dynasty was not only the only surviving NPC dynasty in the world, but it also unified the entire Indian region. It was an unparalleled glory, and it made the lords who fell midway feel ashamed. For example, King Akbar of the Gudo dynasty, whether it was Akbar or the Mayan king, as the backbone of the Azerbaijan camp, they both made the same choice when the dynasty was destroyed, to move to the Germanic dynasty. They would bring a group of confidants and obtain a new life in the Germanic dynasty. Not only that, according to the information obtained by the Black Snake Guards, in the past year, members of the Azerbaijan scattered all over the world had begun to quickly gather in the Germanic dynasty. Obviously, this was the strategic arrangement of the Azerbaijan. They were prepared to concentrate their strength in one place because they knew very well that with the evolution of the game world, it was better to concentrate on one place than to blossom everywhere. The Germanic dynasty was the chosen base camp of the Azerbaijan. A few days ago, Gaia released a piece of news on the official website, saying that after the immigration fleet arrived on Planet Hope, for safety reasons, they would not send everyone to the surface of Planet Hope. Before the Vanguard forces establish a stable base on Planet Hope, the fleet staying in outer space is a safer choice, Gaia explained. In this regard, players around the world gave their support. Although everyone was eager to return to reality, it did not mean that everyone would take their own lives as a joke. The dangerous environment of Planet Hope was really daunting. After all, Planet Hope was not a game world. If you died, you would really die. There was no chance of rebirth. Therefore, in today's highly prosperous game world, there is actually nothing wrong with staying in the fleet. If it wasn't for the fact that the resources stored by the fleet were not enough to sustain the fleet's existence in outer space, some people would even be willing to live in the game world for the rest of their lives. At least in the game world, there was no true death. One of the missions of the forward operating base was to obtain resources from Planet Hope to feed the immigration fleet in space. The immigration fleet, on the other hand, served as the main population base, providing a steady stream of talents for the base. At the same time, the raw resources of the forward operating base were also provided by the fleet. This formed a virtuous cycle that complemented each other. As the interstellar fleet's resource reserves were very limited, Gaia announced the first batch of forward operating bases after careful calculations. There were only a pitiful 3. The selection criteria were simple. The Emperor dynasty would be first in line. If there weren't enough spots for the Emperor dynasty, then the strongest dynasty would be selected. The lowest standard was a dynasty. Those below the dynasty would not be considered even if they did not have enough slots. In the entire world, only the Grand Xia and the Dawson clan were empires. A third empire had yet to be born. This also meant that the remaining 9 empires would have to fight for the final spot until their heads bleed. No dynasty would not fight for it. Even an idiot knew the weight of a forward operating base. In other words, this forward operating base was the prototype of a future country on Planet Hope. Whoever controlled the forward operating base would obtain the highest authority on Planet Hope. Just this point alone was enough to explain everything. There was no need to talk about any specific benefits. Among the various competitors, the Dark Knight Empire, the Germanic dynasty, the Romanov dynasty, and the Persian Empire were the most competitive. As for which one was stronger, it was still unclear. Because of this, the azure emblem was betting on the Germanic dynasty. It could be imagined that if the azure emblem failed to seize the third spot, then it would be difficult for the azure emblem to achieve anything great on Planet Hope in the future. Because of this, the azure emblem's resistance in the Mayan battlefield and the Tianzhu battlefield could not be considered fierce. Similarly, if this spot fell into the hands of the Romanov dynasty or the Persian Empire, then the Silver Hand Camp would obtain 2 spots and establish their position as the overlord of Planet Hope. This was something that even Ouyang Shua did not want to see. In contrast, although the Dark Knight Empire was powerful, it was weak in overseas expeditions and lacked strategic space. Even when it would be promoted to a dynasty was a problem, so it was the least competitive one. It was believed that this problem had long been placed on the highest agenda of the Dark Knight Empire. According to the information revealed by Gaia, the first batch of 3 subbases would form a 1 main 3 combination with the main base established by the advanced fleet. It would become the bridgehead for humans to land on Planet Hope. Needless to say, the main base would naturally be personally controlled by Gaia. It was also the hub and brain for humans to land on Planet Hope. Gaia also timely announced the construction status of the main base. After 5 years of construction, the outpost base established by the advanced fleet had gradually developed from a small camp to a giant city, radiating thousands of miles. The city itself had achieved self-sufficiency. The tall city wall, the sky full of AWACS, and the pitch-black cannon muzzles on the city wall gave people a sense of security. Of course, a detail that could not be ignored was the mottled blood stains on the city wall and the piles of bones at the foot of the city wall. These were all left behind by the monsters that attacked the city. It was a sobering reminder to all humans of how dangerous Planet Hope was. On the 6th of October, India, with the destruction of the Godo dynasty, the army of the Ashoka dynasty began to retreat from the Godo dynasty's territory in an orderly manner according to the agreement between the 2 parties, giving up the land to Great Xia. The cooperation agreement between the 2 parties was thus completed. From then on, no one could tell whether the 2 dynasties would continue to cooperate and rule India together, or whether they would start a new round of overt or covert struggle over the right to speak in India. At least Ashoka was still uncertain and even confused. Fortunately, this confusion did not last for too long. Great Xia soon gave an answer. On the 8th of October, before the army of the Ashoka dynasty had completely retreated from the territory of the Godo dynasty, the Great Xia Northern Army brazenly came out under the command of Li Jing and declared war on the Ashoka dynasty. India, which had just calmed down, reignited the flames of war. Chapter 1335. Great Xia's sudden declaration of war left Ashoka completely dumbfounded. King Ashoka had speculated many ways to deal with Great Xia in the future, but he had never expected Great Xia to be so ruthless. They had just ended their cooperation, but they were already waving their butcher's knife at the Ashoka dynasty, turning hostile like flipping a book. The Great Xia Northern Army consisted of 14 field legions and 700,000 elite troops. They were divided into 3 groups and brazenly charged into the hinterland of the Ashoka dynasty from the frontier fortress of the Shikam province. 2 years ago, when the Ashoka dynasty attacked Tubo, they took the same path. At the same time, the Great Xia Southern Army and the Western Army, which had already met up in the Godo dynasty, quickly headed north. They chased after the army of the Ashoka dynasty and brazenly launched an attack on their former allies. The vast Gudwa Empire was the logistics base of the Great Xia army, and they had nothing to fear. It had to be said that the timing that Great Xia chose to start the war was too coincidental. At this time, half of the forces of the Ashoka dynasty were stationed in the territory of the Peacock dynasty, responsible for guarding the prisoners of war and wiping out the remaining bandits. 40% of the forces were still in the territory of the Godo dynasty. Only 10% of the troops were left in the mainland, which was less than 150,000. Most of them were concentrated in the capital city of Delhi. Such a military force would not be able to fight back against the Great Xia's northern route army, which had been resting and accumulating strength and had been eyeing them covetously. Under Li Jing's superb command, the Great Xia dynasty's northern route army attacked from three sides. They were like a torrential flood that swept away all resistance. Wherever they went, the cities surrendered. The northern army did not give the enemy any chance. This was the Tang Empire's god of war, Li Jing. If he didn't make any mistakes, he was simply the enemy's nightmare. According to the plan, the three armies of the North Army would meet in Delhi and take down the most important city in the Indian district. Then, with Delhi as the base, they would sweep through the entire Ganges plain. This was the most crucial step. Once the city of Delhi and the surrounding Ganges river plains were occupied by the Great Xia, even if the Ashoka dynasty had the territory of the Peacock dynasty as a strategic rear, it would be difficult for them to make any big waves. Therefore, the Battle of Delhi was the key to this battle. At this time, King Ashoka was still comforting the people in the Peacock imperial court. When he heard the news of the war with the Great Xia, he was so angry that he vomited blood and almost fainted. Shameless, Ashoka, who woke up, was drenched in cold sweat. Everything that happened in the past few months flashed through Ashoka's mind like a movie. Gradually, they formed a clear line that made one's heart tremble. So, from the very beginning, the so-called alliance was a trap. Ashoka's mouth was dry, and his heart was filled with bitterness. The Great Xia's scheme was too vicious. First, they provoked internal strife in the Indian district to consume the strength of India. Then, they pretended to ally with the Ashoka dynasty to eliminate the two major threats, the Peacock dynasty and the Gudod dynasty. In the end, they revealed their true colors and pointed their weapons at the Ashoka dynasty. I should have known. Great Xia is ambitious. How could they be satisfied with the Gupta dynasty? Ashoka hated his own greed and stupidity for falling for Great Xia's trick. It was greed that blinded Ashoka's eyes, causing him to collaborate with Great Xia and set off the Great Indian War. It was also his foolishness that caused King Ashoka to gradually lower his guard against his ally, Great Xia. He kept moving his troops away from his homeland, causing the defenses of his homeland to be weak, giving Great Xia an opportunity to take advantage of. What made Ashoka even more miserable was that after the last game update, there was only one teleportation circle in the Indian district in Delhi. It was impossible for Ashoka to return to Delhi quickly. The thought of his nest being breached by the enemy at any time made Ashoka anxious. No, I can't give up. Ashoka's eyes were red like a gambler who had lost and was ready to bet everything. In fact, it was not that the Ashoka dynasty had no chance of winning. Firstly, the army of the Ashoka dynasty was still there. There were more than 1,400,000 soldiers, and after more than a year of war, all of them were elite troops. Secondly, as long as the Ashoka dynasty could get through the most difficult time and delay the war, they could turn the prisoners of war of the Peacock dynasty into active forces and enter the battlefield. At the same time, Ashoka could also recruit soldiers on the spot. In short, there were two strategic goals for the Ashoka dynasty at the moment. One was to arrange for the army to travel day and night to reinforce Delhi. The army of the Ashoka dynasty had to enter Delhi before the army of Great Xia to be able to defend the capital. As long as the capital did not fall, the Ashoka dynasty would exist forever. Secondly, they had to fight for time and turn this war into a protracted war to win the opportunity for the dynasty to recruit troops. What was even more amazing was that it was already October and winter was coming soon. Therefore, from the perspective of the weather, it was more advantageous for the Ashoka dynasty. In addition, the Ashoka dynasty was fighting on their own territory, and they had all the advantages. There was no reason to say that the Ashoka dynasty would not be able to win this war. When the generals were gathered for a meeting, Ashoka spoke passionately. Ashoka's words lit up the hearts of the generals. All of them were in high spirits, and their blood was boiling. They threatened to completely drive Great Xia out of India. "We won't even give them the Gupta dynasty," the general said. At this military meeting, Ashoka made a decision to send 150,000 elite troops from the Peacock dynasty and the Gupta dynasty to travel day and night to reinforce Delhi. Ashoka was responsible for coordinating the remaining troops and personally leading them to fight the decisive battle with the Great Xia army. "If we lose this war, I can only atone for my sins with death." Before the expedition, Ashoka made a blood oath, which made the generals howl in agitation. "Fight to the end. If we don't win, we won't return." It had to be said that the ruthless Ashoka did not have any cowards under him. They were all heroes who dare to die. October 15th, Bangalore City. After sending off the advance troops, Ashoka prepared to set off with the army. On that day, the massive army of more than 500,000 soldiers held an oath ceremony. Then, they escorted Ashoka out of Bangalore City and set off for the mainland. In the face of Great Xia's provocation, the Ashoka dynasty accepted the challenge. This was the biggest battle in the Indian region. Whoever won would be the master of the Indian region. At the same time, in the capital, the news of Ashoka leading his troops in a battle was reported to the capital by the Black Snake Guards. Imperial Palace, Imperial Study. Ouyang Shuo hung up the video call with the Black Snake Guards and revealed a complicated smile. "Ashoka, have a safe journey." As he spoke, Ouyang Shuo took out a mysterious talisman. It was the Imperial Death Talisman that Gaia rewarded him when he was promoted to a dynasty. After using it, he could designate any NPC emperor to die immediately. Without hesitation, Ouyang Shuo picked up the brush and wrote Ashoka's name on the blank space of the talisman. In an instant, the talisman spontaneously combusted and turned into a golden light. With a whoosh, it passed through the barrier of space and entered the body of Ashoka, who was thousands of miles away. Chapter 1336. Ashoka was dead, and he died without a sound. As the only NPC emperor in the world, Ashoka enjoyed unparalleled authority in the Ashoka dynasty. He could decide the life and death of people with a single word. He was the soul of the Ashoka dynasty. Because of this, Ashoka's sudden death was a devastating blow to the Ashoka dynasty. The morale that had just been boosted instantly fell to the freezing point. The troops didn't know if they should launch a counterattack against the invasion of Great Xia, according to the predetermined plan, or escort the king's body to the capital to select a new successor of the dynasty. On the other side, Great Xia's attack was getting fiercer. At this time, if the Peacock King was still in India, he might be able to rise up and raise the flag of the Peacock dynasty again. However, the moment the Peacock dynasty was destroyed, the Peacock King was listed as a key target by Ashoka and sent to the Reincarnation Temple. The Peacock King had no choice but to join another country. In addition, the King of Mando had long since defected to the Germanic dynasty. At this time, the Indian region could be described as a group of dragons without a leader. In the face of the attack of Great Xia, defeat was only a matter of time. October 18th, Jingshi. After using the Imperial Death Talisman to kill Ashoka, Ouyang Shuo didn't pay much attention to the situation in India. Under such circumstances, if the Great Xia army still couldn't occupy the entire territory of India, it would be a real failure. Part of Ouyang Shuo's mind was used to deal with the aftermath of the Battle of Maya. After the establishment of the Caribbean province, the American theater of operations adjusted the defense areas of the three major armies to adapt to the new situation. The North American Army, which was previously stationed in the Columbia province, was now stationed in the newly established Caribbean province as the main border defense force against the Dawson dynasty. With the end of the Battle of Maya, the Dawson dynasty entered a short period of dormancy. In order to destroy the Maple Leaf dynasty, the Dawson dynasty spent nearly a year. In order to deal with the Maya dynasty, the Dawson dynasty spent nearly a year. The continuous war for 2 years was also a huge drain on the Dawson dynasty. Whether it was the people or the material resources, they were on the brink of being stirred up and urgently needed to recuperate. In addition, they had to appease the occupied areas. Therefore, although the global situation was changing and it was a great opportunity for heroes to rise up and make achievements, Jack didn't let victory get to his head. He stopped very rationally and focused on managing the internal affairs. Jack knew very well that only by managing North America well could they talk about other things. What's more, Gaia had announced 3 bases, and if there were no surprises, one of them would be the Dawson dynasty. Naturally, Jack was no longer as anxious as before. After all, stability trumps everything else. Of course, recuperating didn't mean that he didn't do anything. Similar to what the Grand Xia had done in the past, the Dawson dynasty didn't forget about its overseas territories while strengthening its internal affairs. The Dawson dynasty's only overseas territory was naturally the Central African region. Previously, Jack had been busy with the Mayan battle and had not had the energy to care about the African continent. Now that the Mayan conflict had been resolved, Jack naturally could not tolerate the Bantu dynasty's arrogance. There would probably be a good show in the upcoming war in Africa. Generally speaking, the retreat of the Dawson dynasty was also a great opportunity for the North American army to establish a line of defense and border fortifications in the Caribbean province. The South American army was still stationed in the Amazon province, Brasilia province, and Uruguay province. As for the Brave Tiger Army, they were transferred from Brasilia province to Colombia province. It had been more than a year since the Brasilia dynasty had submitted. The 3 South American provinces had already stabilized, and the internal conflicts had gradually been eliminated. There were no more major hidden dangers. As such, there was no need for the Brave Tiger Army to be a deterrent in Brasilia province. As for the threat of the Indian Empire, it was basically non-existent. Although the Indian Empire was no longer an ally of the Grand Xia, Juarez knew very well that there would not be a good outcome if they went against the Grand Xia. The current stability of South America was the greatest benefit of the Indian Empire. In addition, it was very difficult for the Indian Empire to obtain a spot in the forward operating base of Planet Hope. In the future, Juarez would have to rely on the Grand Xia for the affairs of Planet Hope, so he would not be presumptuous. Of course, he still had to take precautions. Ouyang Shua did not wish for the American protectorate that he had painstakingly established to fail miserably. The transfer of the Brave Tiger Army to Colombia province was tantamount to playing the role of a connecting link. They could go north to support the Caribbean province, and they could also go south to support the 3 South American provinces. The situation in the American war zone was thus settled. Apart from the adjustment to the American war zone, there was also the handling of the mercenaries. After 2 major battles, the mercenary army that was initially formed had a total of 9 corps. Now, there were only 6 corps left, which amounted to a total of 300,000 soldiers. After the tempering of the 2 battles, the surviving mercenaries were already true elites, and their combat strength was not much different from the Grand Xia regular army. In view of the outstanding achievements of the mercenaries in the American war zone, Ouyang Shua decided to secretly give them the designation of the Spectre Army. Due to the flexible characteristics of the mercenaries, Ouyang Shua even allowed the Spectre Army to have special privileges in the entire army. There was no limit on the number of corps, and they could be adjusted according to the actual situation. This was also a reward for the mercenaries. From now on, they would be secretly registered as the regular army of the empire, and they were essentially no different from other army groups. In order to better control this army group, Ouyang Shua ordered to secretly promote the former commander of the Royal Forest Guards, Seng Wuquan, to the position of the commander of the Spectre Army. Seng Wuquan was the 9th younger brother of Seng Wufan. He graduated from a private school in Xiang Village and was one of the main generals of the Xiang Army. Because he was good at digging trenches to besiege cities, he was given the title of Iron Bucket Sung. With Seng Wuquan around, Ouyang Shua could truly be at ease with the Spectre Army. The commander position left behind by Seng Wuquan was taken over by the commander of the Royal Forest Guard's 5th Corps, Lin Jing. The deputy commander of the 1st Corps, bright moon illuminates the river, was promoted to the commander of the 5th Corps. As such, the internal structure of the Royal Forest Guards was also reshuffled. Lin Jing's invisible promotion was an obvious signal. Ouyang Shuo had firmly grasped this special army in his hands. As the situation in the American war zone stabilized, it was no longer appropriate to leave the Spectre Army in the American Protectorate. After a proposal from the Privy Council, the Imperial Court decided to secretly transfer the Spectre Army to the African War Zone to carry out a secret military operation codenamed Steel Forging. This operation was related to the Empire's layout in Europe, and it was clear how much importance the Imperial Court placed on Spectre Army. The atmosphere in the European battlefield was very strange, and Ouyang Shu couldn't make up his mind at the moment. Therefore, he ordered the Spectre Army to act according to the situation after arriving in Africa. On the 20th of October, Gaia suddenly revealed a piece of news on the official website. It made all the players around the world fall into a dead silence. Even Ouyang Shuo's expression changed drastically. Chapter 1337. Gaia 9th Year, 20th of October. It was a day worth remembering. At 9 in the morning, Gaia suddenly released a video on its official website. The video showed the base that the advanced fleet had built on planet Hope, Hope City. The players were no strangers to this city. Not long ago, when Gaia announced the construction plan for planet Hope, they had also announced the latest construction situation of Hope City. The majestic city was very reassuring. What was shocking was that the city that carried the hope of humanity was now in a sea of fire. Above the city, hundreds of wyverns with wings that covered the sky and large scales were circling around. Their mouths were filled with fangs as they spewed out scorching flames. The flames were so domineering that they turned the steel city into molten iron. It was terrifying. And at the city wall, a row of 10-meter-tall titans wielding hammers the size of cars smashed the seemingly sturdy city wall into pieces. It was unknown what the hammers were made of, but they had such power. Under the hammers, the reinforced concrete city wall was like tofu, unable to withstand a single blow. Even the ground was shaking as cracks the size of bowls appeared. Before this, no one would have imagined that there would be such a domineering way of attacking a city in the world. As the city wall collapsed, the dire beast horde that had been surrounding the city surged into the city like a tidal wave. The number of dire beasts was so great that it was impossible to count them. It formed a sea of dire beasts. Among the dire beasts, the players discovered familiar Tyrannosaurus, pterosaurs, and velociraptors. There were also dire beasts that the players had never seen before. All of them were ferocious and imposing. In the city, humans were like ants as they were ravaged by all sorts of dire beasts. The dire beast tide that filled the sky nearly drowned the entire city. What was even more terrifying was that the humans' laser weapons and even laser cannons were ineffective when they hit the fire dragons or titans. Even the other dire beasts only suffered some flesh wounds under the laser gun's attack. Upon closer inspection, it turned out that the bodies of these top dire beasts were covered with a thin layer of energy. It completely blocked the attacks of the human weapons, preventing them from causing any damage to their bodies. These top dire beasts were the culprits behind the destruction of the city. Without their leadership, the dire beast horde would not have been able to successfully attack the city. Ouyang Shuo looked at the image of the city of hope that was gradually turning into ruins. His face tightened, and he began to wonder why he had not seen such fire dragons or titans in the dire beast atlas that Gaia had revealed. Previously, Gaia had rewarded Ouyang Shuo with a Planet of Hope's resource handbook. It contained information on the various beasts on Planet of Hope. It was more complete than the game. Even so, Ouyang Shuo found the ferocious beast tide extremely unfamiliar. It was reported that after the Vanguard fleet built their base, they arranged for artificial satellites to conduct a full coverage of Hope Planet with no blind spots. In the following period of time, a large number of drones were sent deep into the wilderness, forests, mountains, deserts, swamps, and other places on Hope Planet to conduct detailed investigations. Dire beasts, Dragons. Of. From the dire beast, dire beast. As drones. Try. Dragons of the dragons recorded the drones recorded alive. If necessary, the drones could even send out robots to collect specimens. That was how most of the dire beasts in the game came. Logically, it was impossible for dire beasts like the fire dragons and titans to escape the drone's detection. Ignoring everything else, just the heat emitted from their bodies could be sensed by the drone's heat conduction devices. If not, then the only explanation was that these beasts had extraordinary intelligence. They were either hiding deep in the mountains, in caves, or in swamps to avoid detection. The hammer in the Titan's hand also proved this point. The hammer was obviously forged. This meant that these top dire beasts had mastered the forging method. Perhaps they could no longer be seen as simple beasts. Instead, they were another type of intelligent species. They were on equal footing with humans. After 4 years, these dire beasts emerged from their hiding places and quickly gathered together. Under the leadership of the top dire beasts, they destroyed the invaders in one fell swoop. Such a guess made Ouyang Shuo shudder. Without a doubt, be it Gaia or humans, they had greatly underestimated the danger of Planet Hope. It was a planet far more dangerous than the game world. There were too many mysterious creatures living on the planet. Ouyang Shuo could no longer determine if the fire dragons and titans were the top dire beasts on Planet Hope. Perhaps there were even more domineering creatures above them. Against these top dire beasts, ordinary laser weapons were useless. Perhaps missiles could cause serious damage to these dire beasts, but they might not be able to kill them. Moreover, missiles were long-range weapons. They were not suitable to deal with the dire beasts that had already entered the city. Above the missile was the nuclear bomb. Unfortunately, Earth had already destroyed all nuclear weapons in the Federation era. Not to mention the advanced fleet, even the interstellar migration fleet, did not carry nuclear bombs. Even if they did, it was not suitable to use them. Planet Hope was humanity's last hope. If they fired a nuclear bomb, it would be equivalent to suicide. They would personally send Planet Hope to its doom. Even Planet Hope could not withstand a few nuclear bombs. Ouyang Shuo was even more worried. If they fired a nuclear bomb, not only would the radiation not have any side effects on the dire beasts, it would also stimulate the dire beasts to mutate and increase the danger on Planet Hope. If that was the case, they would really be shooting themselves in the foot. At the end of the video was the City of Hope, which had been completely reduced to ruins. Above the ruins of the city, the dire beasts were roaring at the sky and celebrating wantonly. Their faces seemed to be filled with mockery. The entire advanced fleet was left with 2 spaceships that were still in Planet Hope's orbit. They floated alone on the orbit, recounting a sense of desolation. Humanity's first expedition to Planet Hope had ended in a crushing defeat. Many players cried after watching the video. They could not accept such a failure. Some even said sorrowfully, could it be that humanity no longer has a way out? The destruction of the City of Hope seemed to represent the destruction of humanity's hope. Even the City of Hope, which had been built for 4 years, seemed so vulnerable in front of the dire beasts. People could not imagine how the 3 subbases that the fleet was about to build could survive on Planet Hope. The 3 spots that Gaia had given out had gone from being highly sought after to a hot potato. What should we do? People were shouting, panicking, and asking for help. Gaia gave them a solution. Chapter 1338. After releasing the video of Hope City's destruction, Gaia provided a response plan. According to the star maps sent by the advanced fleet, there was a resource planet not far from Hope Planet. On the planet, there were all kinds of ores, coal, and oil resources. It was an industrial base that humans dreamed of. The problem was that the resource planet had all kinds of resources except for biological resources. The photos show that the resource planet was a desolate, dead planet with no living creatures. The only water resources were located in the ice layer at the north and south poles. The ice layer was extremely solid. There was no sunlight all year round, so naturally there were no signs of life. More importantly, because it was a desolate resource planet, the polar ice layer was rich in all kinds of heavy metal elements. It was seriously polluted and could not be drunk at all. At most, it could only be used in factories. Otherwise, life wouldn't have been born. This also meant that the resource planet could not be used as a new human settlement. Gaia's plan was to arrange for the interstellar fleet to temporarily stop at the resource planet. There were two main purposes. First, to use the mineral resources of the resource planet to produce combat robots on a large scale to prepare for the second expansion of Hope Planet. Without sufficient strength, it was impossible to establish a foothold on Hope Planet. Second, to develop combat mecha. This was another creative, scientific result after Gaia's materialization. Facing those top dire beasts, even the strong adventurers could not face them easily. Gaia's solution was to let the players combine with the mecha and become the top combat power. Of course, the materialized generals could also pilot the mecha. The problem that needed to be solved was that the resources carried by the interstellar fleet could not last for too long, especially the nutrient solution for the players. It was nearing the limit. Without the nutrient solution, the players could not survive in the fleet. Since the resource planet could not obtain biological resources, it was naturally impossible to produce nutrient solution. The only way was to send another advanced fleet to land on Hope Planet for the second time. After landing, the nutrient solution would be produced on Hope Planet and sent to the resource planet. The resource planet could continuously send combat robots and combat mecha to the advanced base on Hope Planet, increasing the military strength of the base. This would form a virtuous cycle. The ultimate goal was to establish a foothold on Hope Planet. The problem now was, at this moment, who was willing to step forward and lead the second advanced fleet to land on that extremely dangerous planet, risking their lives to establish a forward base again? Gaia did not give an answer. No one could give an answer. The mission was dangerous, and they had to maintain a positive interaction with the resource planet. Thus, they had to go there voluntarily. Otherwise, the plan would not be able to be carried out smoothly. The time the interstellar fleet would arrive at the resource-rich planet was estimated to be June of the 10th year of Gaia. That was to say, there were nearly 8 months left for the players of the world to make their choice. Due to the limited resources of the interstellar fleet, they could not afford to fail a second time. Not everyone could go if they wanted to. One of the conditions was that the participant had to be one of the current feudal lords. Only the lords who had survived until now had the experience and courage to explore the wastelands. In this way, the range was greatly reduced. Faced with this dilemma, players all over the world were asking, who will step forward bravely? The 12 lords, including Ouyang Shuo, all remained silent. They weren't in a hurry to express their opinions. It wasn't that they were cowards, but rather that this matter was of great importance and they had to think it through. Recklessness had never been the character of a lord. October 25th, the capital. Gaia's sudden revelation caused the entire game world to fall into an awkward silence. Even the European battlefield, where the battle was the most intense, had a rare temporary pause. Faced with such an unprecedented impact, the domain lords had to slow down and properly organize their thoughts. The only one that was still fighting was India. Great Xiao's opponent was an NPC dynasty, so naturally, there was no pressure at all. Ouyang Shuo wasn't a sentimental emperor. Although the road to the future had been changed out of nowhere, it wasn't enough to make Ouyang Shuo afraid and stop on the road to hegemony. No matter how the future changed, there was no harm in expanding Great Xiao's territory in the game world. It was at times like this that the feudal lords needed to show extraordinary determination and courage. They also needed to have a long-term strategic vision. Otherwise, they were destined to be eliminated. The battle in India wasn't intense, and there weren't many variables. The only thing they needed to do was wait for the 3 armies of Great Xia to flatten the already fragmented Ashoka dynasty. On the morning of the 25th, news of victory came. Under the command of Li Jing, the Great Xia Northern Army was the first to break through Delhi City and obtain a crucial victory in the battle in India. This basically meant that the entire India had been brought under the rule of Great Xia. The remaining sporadic resistance was no longer enough to cause a huge wave. In view of the approaching winter, Ouyang Shual and the cabinet began to study the administrative division of India and the relevant personnel arrangements before the battle in India was completely over. According to the previous plan, the imperial court would establish the protectorate of South Asia in the entire South Asia subcontinent, which was also the empire's fourth protectorate overseas. In principle, the South Asia protectorate would be planned to have 6 provinces, 3 of which were named after the old dynasty, namely Ashoka Province, Pequot Province, and Modo Province. They were also the 3 core provinces of the protectorate. The former Protector General of the Western Border, Feng Xiaohuang, was transferred to the Protector General of South Asia. The situation in India was complicated and the internal forces were complicated. The degree of recognition of Great Xia was also relatively low. However, its strategic location was very important, and it was densely populated and rich in resources. It wasn't an easy task to govern the South Asia protectorate well. That was why Ouyang Shual had chosen Feng Xiaohuang, who was outstanding and had once been Prince Jin, to be the Protector General of South Asia and guard this vital place for the empire. Guarding the South Asia Protectorate was basically guarding the entire Indian Ocean. Feng Xiaohuang stepped down as the Protector General of the Western Border and was promoted by the former governor of Minnan, Xiongba. There is no doubt that this was an unprecedented important position that Ouyang Shual had placed Xiongba in. As a result, Xiongba also became the first lord who wasn't from a mountain and sea alliance to take on the position of Protector General. There were 2 reasons for Ouyang Shual to do this. Firstly, Xiongba was capable. Many times, Xiongba compared himself to Chao Mengde in history, saying that he was a capable minister who ruled the world and an ambitious man in troubled times. As an ambitious man, Xiongba had once been glorious, but he was defeated in the end. As a capable minister, he did a good job as the governor of Minnan. The key was that he didn't have any other thoughts. Secondly, he wanted to win over the old aristocratic families. Xiongba was one of the representatives of the aristocratic families. His promotion would be a clear signal. Ouyang Shual would never kill the descendants of the aristocratic families. He would only promote talent. Chapter 1339. Apart from the Protector General candidates, Ouyang Shual also named a few officials. The former governor of southern Sichuan, Zhao Pu, was transferred to South Asia Protectorate to assist Feng Xiaohuang in dealing with South Asia affairs. As the founding hero of Northern Song, Zhao Pu was definitely qualified for his new post. The governor of southern Sichuan left by Zhao Pu was promoted to Ouyang Shual's distant third uncle, Ouyang Huan. At this time, the mystery of Ouyang Shual's personnel arrangement in southern Sichuan was finally revealed. 2 years ago, Ouyang Shual had already paved the way for Ouyang Huan to be promoted to governor of southern Sichuan. Although southern Sichuan province was not classified as Zhili province, it was still the capital city and had an extraordinary strategic position. Ouyang Shual could only be assured by handing it over to a member of the royal family. In addition, Lei Fan, the governor of Izhou, was promoted to the governor of Fengduo province. Lei Fan was born as a mountain barbarian and was familiar with the mountains. He was the most suitable person to govern the mountainous Fengduo province. Li Shanzhong, the governor of Xiangnan, was transferred to the governor of Au province. Au province was the core province of the South Asia Protectorate. Therefore, Ouyang Shual arranged for an experienced official like Li Shanzhong to oversee it as a show of support for the South Asia Protectorate. In addition, the imperial court also chose 2 outstanding officials from the local governors to be promoted to the position of governor of South Asia. The remaining 2 governor positions were reserved for the natives of Tianzhu. At this point, the personnel arrangement of the South Asia Protectorate was finalized. There was the talented Feng Xiaohuang to oversee the overall situation. There were also experienced officials like Zhao Pu and Li Shanzhong as the mainstay. There were also old officials like Lei Fan, newly promoted rookies, and natives. Basically, everything was done, In addition to internal affairs, the army had to be adjusted after the empire took over Tianjin. After the establishment of the South Asia Protectorate, the South Asia War Zone would be transferred from the previous Xikang province to the South Asia Protectorate to be responsible for the defense of the entire protectorate. Only then would it be justifiable. At the same time, the Xikang Construction Corps that previously belonged to the South Asia War Zone would be transferred to the West Asia War Zone and still be responsible for the development of Xikang Province. The defense of Xikang Province would be the responsibility of the Xizun Army. In addition to the army, the headquarters of Indian Ocean Fleet would also be transferred to the Indian Ocean. East Africa, India, and Southeast Asia formed an iron triangle that encompassed the entire Indian Ocean. To put it bluntly, the Indian Ocean had already become the backyard of Great Xia. With this, Great Xia would be able to firmly control the seas in the Indian Ocean. One of the foreseeable benefits was that Great Xia would be able to control the transportation of oil from the Persian Gulf. That's right, the Arabian Empire and the Persian Empire were rich in oil, but without Great Xia's permission, the two empires could only use their own oil. Not even a gram of oil could be exported unless it was transported by land. Based on this, Great Xia had a bargaining chip to keep the two empires in check. It could be said that the conquest of India was a milestone for Great Xia. It symbolized that Great Xia had taken a solid step on the road to establishing hegemony in Asia. Unless there was something wrong with their brains, the two empires wouldn't openly fall out with Great Xia. This was especially so for the Arab Empire. Limited by the resources of the dynasty, they were extremely dependent on foreign trade. From now on, they would probably have to rely on Great Xia to survive. Ouyang Shua's premonition was right. On the 1st of November, before Great Xia had completely conquered India, the Arab Empire sent out a diplomatic mission and took the initiative to recognize Great Xia as the hegemon of Asia. Imperceptibly, it once again raised the prestige of Great Xia in the world. The news was personally reported to Ouyang Shua by the Chamberlain of Dependencies. At that time, Ouyang Shua was fishing by the lake. Recently, he had developed a habit of coming to the lake to fish whenever he encountered a major event and needed to be alone to think. It was as if his mind would become clearer this way. After listening to Zhang Yi, Ouyang Shua didn't have a trace of joy on his face. Instead, he said worriedly, "I'm afraid that they have ulterior motives. They came with ill intentions." "Your Majesty, what do you mean?" Zhang Yi didn't understand. Ouyang Shua smiled and waved his hand. "Let's not talk about it now. I'm not sure either." Based on his intuition, Ouyang Shua felt that things weren't that simple. The Arab Empire wasn't a coward. They shouldn't have rushed over to curry favor with Great Xia. There might be other ulterior motives. For example, they wanted to put Great Xia on a pedestal so that they could hide in the back and avoid being urged to be a scapegoat for the humans on Planet Hope. What happened afterwards seemed to confirm Ouyang Shua's judgment. The three major dynasties in Asia, excluding Great Xia, seemed to have agreed beforehand. On the 3rd day of the 11th month of the 9th year of Gaia, the Persian Empire officially recognized Great Xia as the overlord of Asia. The next day, the Romanov dynasty straightforwardly recognized Great Xia as the overlord. With that, the second condition for Great Xia to become an emperor dynasty was officially fulfilled. There was something unusual about the whole thing, especially since the Romanov dynasty, as the overlord, had no reason to rush to recognize Great Xia as the overlord at this time. Once they recognized it, the two countries would be weaker in terms of momentum when they fought on the battlefield in the future. Not only that, once Great Xia became the overlord of Asia, there would be tangible benefits. The most direct benefit was that the financial markets of the three major dynasties had to be open to Great Xia unconditionally. This had extraordinary strategic significance for the promotion of the Great Xia dollar in Asia. Such an act of taking the initiative to admit defeat was not in line with the style of a warring race. Something even stranger had yet to happen. In the following period of time, the Bantu dynasty in the African continent, the Indian Empire in the American continent, and the Caesar dynasty in the European continent expressed their recognition of Great Xia's global status. Even the archenemy of Great Xia, the Dark Knight Empire, expressed their recognition. The successive declarations of these dynasties were equivalent to sending Great Xia to the throne of the world's first emperor dynasty. Even a blind man would not believe that there was no conspiracy behind this. Although these dynasties expressed their stance one after another, and it seemed chaotic and spontaneous, Ouyang Shua could tell at a glance that this was the silver hand and azure emblem quietly exerting their strength behind the scenes. The purpose was also very simple. They wanted Great Xia and Ouyang Shua to be the scapegoat. It could be imagined that once Great Xia was the first to become an emperor dynasty, they would secretly use public opinion to attack and create a great momentum. Then, it was very likely to cause a frenzy of public opinion around the world. Humans were selfish. Even if the players around the world saw through the conspiracy of the two major organizations, they would probably pretend to be deaf and dumb and go with the flow to let Great Xia take on this responsibility. They would step forward bravely and become the great hero of mankind. When that time came, Great Xia, who was completely suppressed, would have to step forward, even if they did not want to. The reason was very simple. Great Xia is the world's number one. It's duty-bound. A huge storm suddenly engulfed the Xia kingdom. Chapter 1340. Faced with the sudden plot, the Great Xia court was in a heated discussion, but no one could come to a conclusion. As the person involved, Ouyang Shua was very calm and did not care about the commotion of the outside world. 15th of November, Jingshur. The battle in India was coming to an end. Without a leader and with no hope, most of the Ashoka dynasty's army wisely chose to surrender and accept the fact that their country had been destroyed. The sporadic resistance could no longer cause any ripples. With Feng Xiaohuang as the leader, a group of important officials had already rushed to India to cooperate with the army to take over the cities and stabilize the people's hearts, hoping to get the South Asia Protectorate on the right track as soon as possible. The palace. At around 10 o'clock in the morning, Jiang Shang, the first minister of the cabinet, and Zhang Liang, the inner cabinet elder and the seal scholar of the executive cabinet, came uninvited to see His Majesty. Your Majesty, the recent trend is somewhat unfavorable to the empire, Jiang Shang said worriedly. That's right, there must be a mastermind behind this, Zhang Liang added. Ouyang Shua smiled faintly and asked, My two beloved officials, do you really think so? His eyes were as clear as an abyss, and his gaze seemed to be able to see through one's heart. This, Jiang Shang and Zhang Liang looked at each other with a calm expression. They were both extremely intelligent people, so their view of the problem was naturally not so simple. The above point of view was just the mainstream view of the court. The two of them came to find out more about His Majesty's background, but they did not expect His Majesty to see through them. It was a little embarrassing. Your Majesty is wise. The two of them could be considered old foxes, so they respectfully flattered him. Ouyang Shua did not beat around the bush. He stood up and walked in front of the global map. He said slowly, The empire grew from a small village with nothing to a global empire with billions of people. It was not my contribution alone, but the people's aspiration, the army's morale, and the work of the officials. I rose from the wilderness, and my achievements today are all thanks to opportunities. It can be said to be a gathering of wind and clouds. After a pause, Ouyang Shua continued, Therefore, no matter how the outside world operates or how noisy it is, I will not shirk from this expedition to Planet Hope. This is the responsibility given to me by the era. I cannot shirk it, and I do not want to shirk it. Ouyang Shua's words came from the bottom of his heart. The moment Hope City was destroyed by the ferocious beasts, Ouyang Shua had an impulse. His blood boiled, and he had the lofty sentiments he had when he first arrived in the wilderness. He wanted to see for himself what kind of dangerous place Planet Hope was. Ouyang Shua had never been a short-sighted person. He knew all too well what this second trip to Hope Planet to establish a forward operating base meant for the interstellar fleet and even the human race. In the face of the survival of the species, personal gains and losses were nothing. It wasn't that Ouyang Shuo was arrogant, but in the entire world, the most suitable person to carry out this task was none other than Ouyang Shuo. If other overlords were go, he wouldn't feel at ease. Perhaps this was fate. When Jiang Shang and Zhang Liang heard this, they were moved and bowed in unison. Your Majesty is benevolent. Both of them had the same point of view. From their point of view, the Great Xia team was the most suitable team for this expedition to Hope Planet. They should show an imposing manner. If they would be secretive, it would seem too petty. Ouyang Shuo waved his hand and asked the two officials to sit down. He restrained his emotions and said with a smile, "Therefore, this storm isn't a crisis, but an excellent opportunity. As for how to make good use of it, I'll have to rely on you all to come up with a plan." Since the Silver Hand and the Azure Badge wanted to be the masterminds behind the scenes, Ouyang Shuo was naturally happy to go with the flow and make use of this opportunity to promote the Great Xia to an imperial dynasty. Before this, Ouyang Shuo was still worrying about how to win against the Dawson dynasty and be the first to be recognized by all the dynasties in the world. Ouyang Shuo wanted to let these two organizations know what it meant to shoot oneself in the foot. Remember, the hearts of the people can be used, and public opinion can be guided according to the situation. Your subjects will not disappoint your Majesty. Jiang Shang and Zhang Liang accepted the decree. For the time being, don't announce our stance to the outside world. Stick to one principle. Don't respond, don't deny, don't admit. Ouyang Shuo instructed. Your subject understands. Then let's leave it at that for now. The cabinet will each draft a report. As for the specifics, we'll discuss it next time. Ouyang Shuo didn't let the two officials slap their heads on the spot. Although the decisions of the Great Xia Imperial Court depended on Jiang Shang and the other officials, there was still a group of capable officials under them who supported the entire internal affairs system, making the decisions of the Imperial Court more scientific. Yes, Jiang Shang and Zhang Liang, the two officials, bid farewell and left in satisfaction. In the afternoon, Ouyang Shuo secretly summoned the commander of the Mountain Sea Guards, Shen Buhai, the commander of the Military Affairs Department, Eli, and the commander of the Black Snake Guards through the communication compass. There was only one goal, which was to let the three organizations secretly monitor the Great Xia Empire during this period of time. They wanted to see who was in favor of the Great Xia Empire stepping forward and who wasn't. Ouyang Shuo wanted to make use of this opportunity to get a good feel of the background of his officials. In the future, when they went to Planet Hope, Ouyang Shuo would definitely bring a team with him. Therefore, from now on, Ouyang Shuo would start planning to split the Great Xia Empire into two groups. One group would go to Planet Hope, while the other would stay in the game world. The selection of people to go to Planet Hope, other than the construction needs, this observation was very important. Just like that, without anyone noticing, a trap set up by the three major organizations had quietly covered the skies of the Empire, observing everything in silence. The fates of many people might change because of this. At night, Ouyang Shuo returned to his bedroom. During dinner, Ouyang Shuo noticed that there was something wrong with his wife's expression. After going to bed, he couldn't help but ask, "Do you have something on your mind?" Song Jia lay in her husband's arms, her bright eyes staring straight at him. She said slowly, "Have you made up your mind?" "You already know?" Ouyang Shuo didn't seem surprised. The husband and wife were too familiar with each other. It was difficult to hide anything from each other. "I know your determination, and I also know that my husband is a man of indomitable spirit. No matter what the outside world says, you will definitely go." Song Jia's voice was low. Yes. Ouyang Shuo was speechless for a moment. He didn't know how to face his wife. No matter what he said during the day, when he returned home, he was still a husband, the father of a pair of children, the pillar of the family, and the object of concern for his family. "What do you plan to do with you, and Luo?" Song Jia finally asked. Ouyang Shuo was silent. Everyone knew about the dangers of Planet Hope. Even Ouyang Shua didn't have the confidence to say that he could definitely do better than the advanced fleet and truly establish a foothold on Planet Hope. Therefore, it was not suitable to bring a pair of children along. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.